apologize to everyone for the delay. Unfortunately, our keynote isn't present yet, but we're going to go ahead and move on with the schedule, and hopefully we hear from her. Hopefully she can pop in a little later and join us, and we'll just get started. So good morning and welcome. My name is Christine Paul. I am one of the former co-chairs of Vermont Law School's Environmental Justice Law Society, and I'm here with Ronnie.
Hey, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. My name is Ronnie. I'm the other former co-chair of the Environmental Justice Law Society. Thanks for being here.
On behalf of EJLS, we welcome you to our symposium entitled BIPOC Contributions to Climate Policy, Past, Present, Future. This is EJLS's first sole organizing of this panel, and we're excited to have you join us as we explore the intersections of racial justice, law, climate policy, environmental policy, while simultaneously celebrating the unending contributions that BIPOC have made to this movement. As many of us know, BIPOC individuals and groups have revolutionized the environmental narrative long before it became a mainstream movement. So today we'll briefly discuss the history of environmental exploitation before diving into how policy can better serve BIPOC communities and voices, what equitable redistribution of resources could mean for environmental policy and environmental justice organizing, and ways in which legal professionals, students, and recent graduates like myself can better serve grassroots organizing. Before we get started with our program, Ronald will go ahead with our land acknowledgement.
Yep, the Environmental Justice Law Society acknowledges the Abenaki people as the traditional land caretakers of the Indokina, which includes part of Vermont, New England, and Quebec. As guests of this unceded territory of the Abenaki and the Monican people, we honor their ancestors, elders, relations past, present, and future.
Before we proceed, I'd like to note a few reminders for our speakers. As we move into our discussions, we remind everyone to remain muted until you're ready to speak. You do have the option to keep your camera on and off. Whoever is speaking will be pinned so that our audience can have a better view of them as they speak, especially if they have a presentation. For our audience, the Q&A function is open throughout today's discussion, and we certainly encourage you to share your questions, your comments, whether they're directed to a specific speaker or a panel in general. Our live stream is also available through Vermont Law School's Facebook and YouTube pages. So please feel free to add your questions to whatever chat function is available to you. Those questions will be shared with us throughout the day so that we can also share them here with our panelists. With that said, we do have a jam-packed day for you. We are hearing from dedicated, inspirational, interdisciplinary thought leaders, speakers, advocates who are contributing to the future of the climate justice movement. So I hope you're all as excited as I am to hear from them. Unfortunately, our keynote speaker isn't available yet, so we're going to move along straight into our first panel, which is going to discuss what it means to center BIPOC voices when we're formulating environmental policy. Our panelists, Alberto Valentin, Environmental Justice and Community Engagement Manager at Washington Department of Transportation, Lanessa Owens-Chaplin, Director of Environmental Justice Projects at the American Civil Liberties Union of New York, and Earl Hatley, retired environmental consultant and co-founder of Lead Agency Incorporated. We'll discuss how policy continues to negatively affect BIPOC communities and how stakeholders can better center BIPOC experiences to develop present and future environmental policy. Our panelists will also discuss how organizing and movement building contributed to the EJ movement as we know it today. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to Alberto, who's going to get us started for today.
Good morning, Christine. Good morning, Roman and everyone. Thank you for having me here. My name is Alberto Valentin. I am the Environmental Justice and Community Engagement Manager of the Department of Transportation in Washington State. I'm responsible for leading the efforts of Title VI and environmental justice compliance for our federal jurisdictions, and also responsible now for co-leading the first environmental justice public policy created in Washington State to enforce environmental justice practices in our public transportation and other 7 public agencies in Washington State. Christine, I don't remember how much time do I have.
You have 15 minutes. Take your time though.
Okay. So I was going to present like a whole presentation, but I didn't know how much time I have. So sorry for that. I'm gonna keep it more simple. Since I have been working with the transportation department, I have had the opportunity to not only work with BIPOC community, but all kind of communities or organizations in Washington State to work in order to improve our environmental justice principles. Every time that I try to present or do a presentation about environmental justice, I always like to speak about the importance of knowing the relationship between environmental justice and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If it wasn't for the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Title VI, today we wouldn't have the creation of environmental justice through the Executive Order 1298 from 1994. Just a brief summary: in 1964 was created Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that prohibit discrimination based on race, color, national origin, and also was extended to individuals with limited English proficiency. After years of lobbying, public participations, organizations asking for a better tool and a better research to go against public institutions and private institutions for causing environmental effects and health disparities over a specific community.
Recording in progress.
Vulnerable populations and overburdened communities. In 1994, the Executive Order 1298 was created. The important difference between Title VI and environmental justice, even though environmental justice for federal jurisdictions is under Title VI, is that Title VI gives the opportunity to people to present against agencies and public institutions that are receiving federal financial assistance to present a complaint against this institution for causing discrimination based on race, color, national origin, and also against limited English proficiency. So any person that has a complaint against this agency because they are causing in their services or the actions of a specific discrimination based on race, color, or national origin, they have the opportunity to present a complaint based on Title VI. On the other hand, we have environmental justice under the Executive Order 1298 from White House that give the opportunity to citizens, doesn't give them the same opportunity to citizens to present a formal complaint against public institution for causing environmental effects or health disparities over a specific action they're causing. So we have a very strong Title VI, an opportunity for people and individuals and BIPOC communities to present complaints against public agencies. But if you ask me, right now, the Executive Order 1298 from 1994 from the White House doesn't have that strong resource for BIPOC communities or Black communities or vulnerable or overburdened communities around the nation to present something against an agency that is causing a specific discrimination based on environmental effect or health disparities. However, public institutions like, in my case, the Transportation Department that are receiving federal financial assistance has the responsibility to enforce environmental justice assessment when NEPA reviews are required. So that's something also very different, very important to understand. We are only responsible to enforce environmental justice assessments when any specific project is receiving federal financial assistance, and that project is required under NEPA, the National Policy Environmental Act from the United States, to enforce a review. If we don't identify a specific low-income or minority communities under the executive order, we are not responsible to enforce any kind of environmental justice assessment. And if we don't do an environmental justice assessment, might be caused that when we submit a Title VI report, for example, to Federal Highway, in our case, from where we're receiving federal financial assistance, it might jeopardize our federal financial assistance. But if we are not enforcing an environmental justice assessment as we are supposed to in a specific action or any specific service or any specific project that we are having here in Washington State, for example, any individual that think that this project is causing any specific overburden or any specific environmental effect or any specific health disparities or even a social economic effect over a particular community that is protected under the Executive Order 1298 doesn't have any kind of resource to present against that agency or my agency to say, hey, this project, I would like to participate. For example, I would like to engage. I would like to make my point. I would like to raise my voice and say something about this project. That those organizations, those groups doesn't have any kind of resource to present against the agency for not performing an environmental justice assessment, even though we have the responsibility to do it. So for now, if we see the Executive Order 1298, that is the only, right now in federal aspects, if we see the Executive Order 1298, for my understanding, is not yet the best resource for public institutions to enforce environmental justice assessment. So that's one of the reasons that after years of public participation, BIPOC communities enforcing participation in the legislature of Washington State, talking with legislators, doing a very hard advocacy. It was created an environmental justice task force from the governor in 2019. That environmental justice task force that collaborated with overburdened and vulnerable populations and also organizations that represent the interests of these organizations, they presented a whole report in 2019 that include several aspects and several strategies and several findings about environmental injustice happening in Washington State in these communities, not only in these communities, but with a particular attention to these communities in Washington State. What was happening, why the specific reasons of the injustice happening in Washington State against these communities in public decisions that are related to environmental justice. And they also, for the first time, they adopted new environmental justice principles. As you know, environmental justice principles, they have been modified since 1991, since the national Black institutions and organizations get together and they created the first 17 EJ principles ever in the United States. These EJ principles have been modified over the years. If you see the Executive Order 1298 from the White House, they didn't adopted those 17 EJ principles, but they adopted three principal environmental justice principles. So now Washington State has around 25 environmental justice principles, thanks to the collaboration of these organizations, these communities, and these particular individuals to enforce these environmental justice principles into the public decisions. So the good thing is that after this report was submitted, the legislature decided that one of the suggestions that the report presented was to create a new legislation that meets or fill the gaps that the Executive Order 1298 didn't have or doesn't have right now. And then 2021, the HEAL Act, the Healthy Environmental for All Act, was created in Washington State, but not for all public institutions in Washington State, only for 7 public institutions, including the Transportation Department, the Ecology Department, the Commerce Department, the Health Department, and some other public institutions that has the obligation and the responsibility to enforce environmental justice principles into their decision. Something very extraordinary about the participation of Black communities, Indigenous communities in the creation of this report was that in a few years ago, this important organization that represent Black communities and minorities and Hispanic communities front and center collaborated. They have a collaboration with the Department of Health or Health Department in Washington State, and they created a magnificent, a very extraordinary tool, demographic tool, that includes information, specific information that collect demographic information around the United States. That a demographic tool that any public institution can use, and it's available for anyone. Through this demographic tool that this organization in collaboration with the Department of Health created, you can collect information related to demographics of individuals. For example, individuals, we have a big community of Russian community living in a particular community. How close that community is close to hazard facilities? How are the rates of asthma cases? How are the rates of heat strokes, or how are the rates of respiratory problems? If they are disabled, they have any kind of disability, they have any kind of limitation of English, they have access to cars, if they have their household income. So thanks to this demographic tool that it was created by the participation, the active participation and the active collaboration of this particular organization that represents Black communities, and the collaboration with the Department of Health, today the HEAL Act, the Health Environmental for All Act that we have in Washington State, it's gonna be better, or it's gonna be easier to implement, because we have a better demographic tool that when we are doing environmental assessment to identify these communities, and being able to identify these communities and do a meaningful involvement of community engagement with this particular community, which is one of the important things, or I would say the most important thing about environmental justice under the HEAL Act, and I would say also in general, is to involve this community in the decision-making process, because that's one of the reasons that overburdening has been happening over the decades, because we haven't involved vulnerable and overburdened communities into our public decision-making process. So the HEAL Act now has 5 principal objectives to enforce in these 7 public institutions. We have the responsibility to create a new community engagement plan. Every single agency that is responsible to enforce the HEAL Act has the responsibility to create a community engagement plan. Or what we need to include in that community engagement plan? Well, we need to include new strategies about how we are planning to involve Indigenous communities, Black communities, minorities, overburdened communities, and vulnerable populations, how we are planning to prioritize these communities when we are doing community engagement or public outreach. Because if we see most of the public institutions that have responsibility to enforce or to do any kind of community engagement or public outreach, they do, and this is my personal opinion, they do a very basic community engagement. They don't do a meaningful involvement with particular communities. And this is why when we are taking public decisions, we don't involve these overburden of vulnerable populations or indigenous communities or Black communities in the decision-making process, because we don't do an extra effort to involvement in the table of decision. So these new community engagement plans that all these 7 public institutions in Washington state need to present also new specific strategies of how we are planning to engage with these particular communities, how we are planning to translate documents, for example, to engage with individuals with limited English proficiency, how we are going to engage or do an extra effort to engage with particular communities that doesn't trust the government, for example, that doesn't rely on participating in the public decision-making process or in the community engagement activities because they don't have that trust, because the public institution, the government hasn't created that trust over the decades. So they don't feel comfortable about assisting or participating in community engagement activity. If we are going to do any kind of refund or any kind of compensation to communities and individuals to participate in the community engagement activities that we have. So number 2, under the HEAL Act, we also have the responsibility, and this is something very extraordinary. We need to create a new template of analysis for the first time ever about how we are planning to incorporate environmental justice principles, the environmental justice principles adopted by the report, by the communities, and by the government that created the HEAL Act into our budget and expenditure decisions. Many states of the United States recently or over the years, like New Jersey, Minnesota, and many other states, they have created something similar to this, but it's not the same. They have created a racial equity analysis statements when they are approving bills, or when they are approving public policies, or when they are approving any kind of budgets, to understand how these public policies or these budgets or this how they are going to impact a specific demographic in their states. In our case, now under this legislation, under the HEAL Act, we have the responsibility to understand how we are planning to use our budget, our future budget and expenditures, and how these can be prioritized to these BIPOC communities, these overburdened communities, these particular communities that we need to protect, or they are protected under the HEAL Act. So we need to create a whole process of evaluation of our budget and expenditures to see how we are going to use this money to not cause an extra burden over these particular communities, but also something very important, how we are going to engage with communities to discuss our future budget and expenditures related to these particular communities, and how we can make sure these particular communities and individuals have an understanding of how we are going to invest this money in the future. The HEAL Act doesn't mean that it is only for overburdened and vulnerable populations. That doesn't mean that the HEAL Act only protects indigenous communities, Black communities, color communities. It doesn't mean that only have an effect over these communities. The HEAL Act has the intention to protect all communities of Washington state. But an important public statement that the HEAL Act does, and also the report does, is that we as a government, we as a public institutions, and this is thanks to the collaboration and to the enforcement and to the great work done by these organizations and by these communities and these stakeholders, is that we acknowledge that we have been discriminated against these individuals, against these communities for decades, and we need to resolve that, and we need to eradicate that discrimination. And the only way we can do that is by prioritizing our public policies and prioritizing our public decisions in the future to these particular communities. Number 3, under the HEAL Act, we also have the responsibility to create a new template for doing environmental justice assessment. So this is something great in comparison to our current responsibility under federal jurisdiction. Why? because under the federal jurisdiction, we only have the responsibility to do environmental justice assessment when NEPA reviews are required. Now, under the HEAL Act, we will have the responsibility to perform environmental justice assessment and doing a meaningful community engagement with these particular communities every time that we have a significant action. And we are supposed to define what is a significant action. And we can include planning, we can include maintenance, we can include everything that we want in that definition, which is something good, because now we have the responsibility to enforce environmental justice assessment, not only in federal jurisdiction or federal financial project, but we also have the responsibility to enforce environmental justice assessment when we have any kind of project or activity happening in transportation department or in the other public institutions that have the responsibility to enforce the HEAL Act. This is something great, because also we have the responsibility to enforce environmental justice assessment whether we identify overburden and vulnerable populations living in the area. We need to perform environmental justice assessment. So what we have been doing is trying to incorporate the new EJ principles that have been adopted by the EJ task force into our new environmental justice assessment, and also including some practices related to Title VI from the Civil Rights Act. So we are trying to incorporate and merge the EJ principles and also the Title VI responsibility. This is very similar to something that the government, the transportation department from Portland has done. They have created certain guidelines to do environmental justice assessments and at the same time enforce Title VI practices. Why is this so important? Because even though environmental justice belongs to Title VI from the Civil Rights Act, they enforce different things. Title VI enforces discrimination based on race, color, and national origin, and environmental justice enforce the eradication of discrimination based on race, color, and national origin against minorities, but related only to environmental effects and health disparities. It is very hard to demonstrate discrimination under the environmental justice, because you need to demonstrate that during planning, for example, this particular public institution caused a discrimination against these communities because it was caused by an intentional discrimination based on race, color, national origin, or limited use proficiency. So it is good to merge both processes in our environmental justice assessment. So that way we are giving more opportunities to communities and organizations to present complaints against our agency, or to present something or justify their case against the agency for not doing an adequate environmental justice assessment. We also have the responsibility to create an Christine, let me know if
yeah. I wish we could listen to you all day, Alberto. You're so passionate about the work that you do. Unfortunately, we do have to keep moving. So, but we do have some time at the end to ask some questions. So I hope we can still hear from you and your work. Lanessa, please, the mic is yours.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks, Ronald, and thanks Vermont Law for having this, and especially the EJLS organization. And Alberto, thanks for your great framework. And I think it's in line with what I'm talking about, so I think this is a good setup. First, my name is Lanessa Owens Chaplin. My pronouns are she, her. I pride myself in being a community lawyer. I've been an attorney for almost 10 years, but I have recently entered the space of environmental justice, and I just want to talk a little bit about the organization I work for and how we started this path towards environmental justice. And I guess I would just quote what Christine said at the beginning, like, there's been Black folks and BIPOC community folks working on this issue long before it became a buzzword. And so I always want to acknowledge that we are new in this space and we've been here for about 5 years. And so acknowledging that we're kind of working and building off the work that's been established already by many, many folks in the BIPOC community. So I work for the ACLU of New York, and we have done environmental justice projects sporadically here and there, but it wasn't anything that was embedded into our strategic plan. We are known for being a civil rights organization, civil liberties organization, a defender of the Constitution, and defender of the Bill of Rights. And I know many of you on this panel today are saying, well, the Constitution wasn't designed for everyone. And that is something that we have struggled with the ACLU for a very long time, right? Just trying to highlight these areas of racial disparities and how the Constitution that we so preserve wasn't meant for communities of color, immigrants, women, et cetera. But we got into this work because there was an infrastructure project by the name of Interstate I-81 in Syracuse, New York, where I'm from. And this project, I think we kind of viewed it as a way to start thinking about how we can continue to desegregate schools. And so the way the Interstate project was presented to us by local and state officials was this project is going to reinvigorate the neighborhood, it's going to revitalize the community, and it's going to stitch back something that the Interstate I-81 original build, part of the mass transit movement, had torn apart. And I think on paper that sounded fantastic, it sounded great. And so I took that project on as the project counsel, and that was my full-time job. As a resident here, I should think I just talk a little bit about myself first. I was born and raised in Syracuse, New York. I grew up in a segregated neighborhood that was also a toxic environment. If you would have told me that when I was 5 through 18, I wouldn't have believed you. I just didn't know anything different. My community is 14% Black. My experience growing up was 100% Black. Syracuse is one of the most segregated cities in our nation. I think this year we probably topped the top 5 of most segregated cities for a city of our size. And so, so this is where I was coming from. And so as I approached this work, my first instinct was, well, what does the community think about this project? How are they feeling about this project? And what is their input? And I quickly learned that we hadn't talked to the community, right? We were looking at this from a purely civil rights lens, in the truest sense of a strict civil libertarian. We need to desegregate schools, and this project's going to integrate the community. So some red flags started to come up for me. And so I had to honestly ask for permission from my legal department to say, I think we should step back a little bit, and I need to do some grassroots organizing, which is my roots. And so prior to going to law school, during law school and after law school, I'd always been an organizer. I organized on campaigns, organized on issues. I will date myself a little bit, but when I was in law school was when Trayvon Martin was shot. And I went to law school in Miami, and I organized the bus to go there and be a part of that protest. I didn't know the name of what I was doing because I wasn't familiar with organizing, but I just knew that there was a necessity and a need that had to be met. And I felt that same urge around this project. And I said, we can't, as a member of this community, specifically this Black community, I cannot in good conscience move forward with this project without knowing at least what every single person in this neighborhood feels, right? And that might sound ridiculous, but that was my goal. And so just beginning to have community meetings, a listening tour, and quickly realizing after talking to hundreds of residents and doing canvassing, knocking on doors, explaining who I was and why I was there, which many of you know on this panel could be challenging. Finding out this wasn't a school integration project. This was actually a school displacement project because integration implied that they were going to be displacing Black folks from their community. And it was also not so much a civil liberties issue as it was an environmental racism, environmental justice, civil rights issue. And I quickly learned that and pivoted what our goals were based on what the community said. And so that's the power of what it really means to impact and lead by the folks that live in the community. And with all the scholars and all the brains of all the Ivy League schools that work at my organization, the community residents had the answer. It wasn't us. Right. And so it wasn't something that we had considered, it was something that they had simply told us the problems were. And so we started to learn about what their issues were and what their concerns were. And we decided to do a full-fledged campaign highlighting and elevating the voice of the folks who were being ignored. And I never want to say the voiceless because they have voices, they have very loud voices. People just tend to ignore them or push them aside or be very dismissive. So we inserted ourselves as stakeholders in the I-81 project and really holding the state accountable for the mass transit movement. And so as much pushback as we would get when we would insert these civil rights issues and insert what we were calling restorative justice, but really was repair, it really was reparations, right? And so the mass transit movement in the 1950s and 60s disseminated Black and brown communities across this country, and New York was no different, right? And so what we were telling the New York State DOT is, we're gonna hold you to a higher standard. We're gonna hold you above the federal regulations. We're gonna hold you above the state regulations, because this is the reparations project. This is the restorative justice project. And so what we did is we drafted a report, and that report really demonstrated the intersections of how a mass transit highway project not only impacts the quality of their life, their health, their well-being, but also their land values, their ability to get jobs, their ability to access wealthier parts of the neighborhood, their abilities to build equity in their homes, right? Besides stating the obvious, right? This community had the highest rates of lead poisoning in children, 1 in 6, which is the nation's highest. It had the highest rates of asthma in the county, right? So besides the obvious, the infant mortality rate was the highest in any county. So besides the obvious, clearly ailing, unhealthy environment they were living in, but what are the other consequences of living in an environmentally unjust community? And those are the things that we began to ask for. And we would jokingly say, if there's 10,000 comments submitted during the NEPA process, with Alberto laid out very clearly for us, right? Which is the public participation process, where the New York State DOT or any state DOT is supposed to be actively engaging the public, right? Specifically if they have named environmental justice communities. In our project, 100% of the project was an environmental justice community, and the engagement was sorely lacking, right? So what we saw the New York State DOT do, which would probably work for more affluent, wealthier, whiter neighborhoods, which is put out flyers, send pamphlets, and then expect feedback. That's not gonna work in a community that has been historically disenfranchised and oppressed, right? And so there's this assumption that, well, that means they just don't care. No, they absolutely do care. But the state and the federal government has shown them time and time again that they don't care, right? And that their voice does not matter. And we're going to ignore you. And we're going to continue to put toxic manufacturers and buildings and highways in your community, whether you fight or not. And so really the heart of the work was, how do we get this community to publicly participate in a project where they think that they're powerless? How do we convince these folks that they do have power, and the power is in numbers? And I think what's important to note is the mass transit movement happened in the 50s and 60s. So many of those folks who were 10 years old, 15 years old, are still walking the streets. And so we can't say, oh, this happened so long ago, things are so different. And so trying to, as a community lawyer, have the community build trust in me to say, we're gonna fight this thing with you. And we can't promise we're gonna win, but we can promise we're gonna fight really hard and use every tool we have in our toolkit to do so as an organization. Wasn't enough to convince community members that they should actively seek a babysitter, right? Catch public transportation, take time off of work, spend their free time focused on an issue that they truly felt in with validation that their voice doesn't matter. The state's gonna do whatever they want. I've probably heard that more times than anything else. And also when you have folks from the community that can remember, no, we actually protested the first development. We didn't go out quietly. We actually protested and fought and did sit-ins, and in the city of Syracuse, they slept in front of City Hall for 24 hours and said, please don't tear down our neighborhood for a highway. So they can say, no, we fought really hard and we lost, Lanessa. So your efforts are futile. They're gonna do what they wanna do. And so we took a different approach. And what we did, our first step was, for public participation, we put together an art exhibit. And so we did a traveling art exhibit, just memorializing and trying to rehash those memories of what this community looked like before the viaduct had come in and disseminated, right? We try to tell the cultural story of who this community was. We try to get buy-in by the hearts and minds of residents who didn't live in this community to say, it's your obligation as an ally or a supporter to elevate the voice of this community and their concerns. And by doing that, we started a postcard campaign where, after meeting with residents for 2 years weekly and canvassing weekly, we were able to kind of formalize 30 different public comment stickers because we didn't want to leave any comment behind. And so we took these stickers to every event, every festival, every fair we could, to say, help uplift this community's voice. And at the end of the art museum, art exhibit, we did a march and a rally. And we did a couple of things to try to invigorate this community to have faith that we can at least move the needle. And a lot was riding on this. Again, I live in this community, so I'm going to have to answer to folks if this falls in my face, right? But this is what the goal was. And at the end of the project, as our tongue-in-cheek comment, we're going to have 80% of comments submitted by this community or folks who are allies of this community. There was a little over 7,500 comments submitted during the public participation process for the New York State DOT, of which 5,200, a little over 5,200 were from the community or either stickers that the community had presented. And so New York State DOT had said this was the most in recent history public comments submitted of any project of any time of their memory. So that was a huge win. And then we started to see these smaller wins where the DOT had proposed an on and off ramp 115 feet across the street from a school. Again, this is another example of environmental racism and this idea that these children aren't worth protecting. And so we marched, we rallied, we held press conferences, and we were able to get the DOT to move that. And that was one success that the community could see that said, wait, we do make a difference, we do make a change. And from there, we've had active community members coming to every single meeting, invigorated and ready to fight the DOT on every aspect of this plan. And that was the goal. And what we have now, from the draft environmental impact statement to the final impact statement, is worlds of a difference. Is it perfect? No, but it's worlds of a difference. And I think that's something that we could only attribute to the Black community that lived in this neighborhood and their activism and advocacy. Because as much as I would like to think that my yelling and my legal expertise and my community lawyering helped lead that initiative, I couldn't do this alone. Me going to the DOT as one person from one organization complaining about a project would not have moved this needle. What really moved this needle was the community's efforts and advocacy and dedication and willingness to work with me to say, let's get this project done right, and let's get some equity out of this project. One of the other big wins we were able to get from the DOT was they agreed to put 4 acres of land into a community land trust for this community. And that was the restorative reparations piece that we were speaking of when thinking about how many folks in the 1950s and 60s from this community, which was 1,300 families, were displaced as a result of the construction. So holding them accountable to say, no, your highway displaced them, and you turn them from landowners to public housing residents. So it's your responsibility to now right that wrong from the past. I think I am running out of time, but what I'll end with is saying that organizations like ours who have been around for 100 years, we're learning, we're growing, and we're expanding our ideas on what it means to really work with impacted communities. We've always worked with impacted communities, but just not in the environmental justice, environmental racism space. We're continuing to grow, and our hope is to continue to work alongside Black and Brown communities to advocate for the things that they would like to see. A perfect example, and I'll leave on this example, is that we were working with parents from the local elementary school about the on and off ramp that the DOT had proposed. And just tongue in cheek, one of the residents said, it shouldn't take this much to convince the state agency not to put an on and off ramp in our kids' backyard. And I had a light bulb, like, you're right. There should be some regulations that discuss this at least. And we quickly learned that there are no regulations in New York State that prohibit the building of schools near any toxic site. So in New York State, we're a state where you can build a school on a Superfund site. You can build a school next door to a landfill. You can build a school next door to a highway. And then by that comment, in my own independent research, I said, wait a minute, there's 23 other states that do regulate how close you can build a school to a major toxin. And so that kind of launched legislation where we said, well, let's introduce legislation in New York State to first say you can't build schools near major roadways. And it's called the SCI Act, Schools Impacted by Gross Highways. And that name came from the students at CMAC Dr. King. So we proposed this idea of this legislation and said, what would you call this bill if you could name this bill? We took a survey, that's what they named it. They're very proud of it. They felt like they are a part of it. They came to Albany with us to lobby our legislators, and the bill was passed by the Senate and the Assembly. So this is the first bill in New York State that actually prohibits building a school near a major area or source of pollution. And we intend to keep them coming. So that's another area that we can say, this is where community and community lawyering can connect to do something positive for the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And wow, thank you for explaining that big win for you. And I hope that many other communities and lawyers can get some sort of takeaway from what you said, just to implement into their work and how they can also work with their communities and better serve them. We're going to move along with Earl, who will be our next speaker. Earl will be talking about how movement building has contributed to the environmental justice movement that we see today. Earl.
Quiet everyone. I'm Earl Hatley. I'm an enrolled member of the Missisquoi Band of Abenaki Nation. My mother was Abenaki from Canada, around the Odanak area. I grew up and lived most of my life in Oklahoma. That's the southern accent that you hear. My father was Chickamauga. He was Cherokee and Shawnee heritage. And I lived, like I said, most of my life in Oklahoma. Have an organization there called Lead Agency. We're dealing with 2,500 square miles of abandoned lead and zinc mines and 4 Superfund sites within that mining district. The Oklahoma portion is the Tar Creek Superfund site, which is 47 square miles of abandoned lead and zinc mines. I am also co-chair of Western Mining Action Network, and that's a network in US and Canada of about 400 organizations that are dealing with lead and zinc mines. Half of those are indigenous groups and tribes, and we have an indigenous caucus, which I chair. I was the Grand River Keeper for the Grand River Watershed for 18 years. Through Lead Agency. I'm now president of the board of Lead Agency, and I'm a member of the council, the Waterkeeper Council for the Waterkeeper Alliance. So I want to kind of change the pace. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a community organizer. That's what I've been all of my adult life, beginning in 1969. I want to throw up some slides for you because I want to show you how organizing got us where we are. We heard from lawyers, and there's 2 tracks really in creating the policies that give us the environmental justice executive order, which is really as far as we've been able to get, and the environmental justice movement. And that was all created by some really outstanding organizing beginning in the 1980s. And well, let's see, I guess I need to go to slideshow here real quick. Well, I don't seem to have control. I was able to get my PowerPoint up, but I don't have control on the slides. So Christine, do you know what's going on here?
I'm not sure, Earl. You can try minimizing your screen, and does that work at all? So you can start from the beginning. If not, I can start it for you.
No, I lost control when I put this up. I'll stop sharing. I don't know what happened there. Oops.
Do you want to give it one last try? If not, we can try and do it for you.
I think you're going to have to try and do it for me. I don't want to waste everyone's time.
All right.
Yeah, if you want to give it a try, you can move the slides for me. Can we do it that way?
Sure, let me just pull
I
it
don't
up.
know what happened. It was working fine when we practiced it. So all of a sudden I don't have control.
Sure, just give me one.
I've never had that problem before. But it's not allowing me to have control once it goes up. So at any rate, what I wanted to say is that in the 1980s, we organized an anti-toxics movement, which led to, if you want to go down the next slide, which led to the creation of an amendment to the Comprehensive Environmental Response and Liability Act, or CERCLA, which created the Superfund program to clean up abandoned hazardous waste sites. The Superfund Amendment, or SARA, in 1986 was the culmination of the anti-toxics movement's efforts. And under that amendment, we got the Right to Know Act, which to me is one of the most important achievements of all of that organizing. And we're losing our right to know now, and that's something that I would like to target for our movement is under the right to know, we not only got access to industry permits and enforcement actions and the activities of federal agencies, we also had the right to know of what's going into transportation, such as hazardous substances and nuclear substances on trains and trucks going down our rails and highways. We used to be able to get that information. Under Homeland Security, all of that information now is pretty much impossible to obtain, even through Freedom of Information Act requests. And permits are, on some things, are getting to a point now where that information is getting harder and harder to obtain. So we're slowly losing what we gained under the Right to Know Act. So that's something that movement folks really need to pay attention to, is the loss of that is happening right now under Right to Know. We also got the toxics release inventory under this. And that's something else I'm going to talk about near the end. That's also a very important gain that we achieved. This requires industry to report their emissions, releases, and transfers of hazardous substances. We also were able to get the fee on industries to pay into the Superfund so that EPA would have a fund to clean up orphaned hazardous waste sites where a responsible party could not be found or refused to cooperate. And so this fund became a hammer for the EPA because under the regulations, if a responsible party refused to cooperate, then EPA could use the fund to pay for the cleanup, and then they could go into court and recover 3 times the cost. So that was the hammer. However, in 1995, the Congress failed to reauthorize the fund, and every subsequent Congress has not reauthorized the fund, and now there is no fund. Next slide. Then in 87, we had the United Church of Christ report, and that report, as we know, identified the fact that communities of color and low income were most likely to host a hazardous waste facility or solid waste facility in their community, impacting their environment. And also an important thing was that it provided the methodology for identifying where these impacted communities are, and that's a methodology that EPA is still utilizing today. Next slide. And as a result of all of this and organizing and rallying of EJ communities, we held the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. in 1991. And that has always been targeted as the beginning of the environmental justice movement. That was followed up by the Southern Organizing Committee on Economic and Social Justice post-summit in 1992 in New Orleans. I attended both of those. I was an organizer for the National Toxics Campaign back then, and I was part of that anti-toxics movement. So what I'm telling you is my experience. I was involved in all of this at the time as a community organizer and an organizer for a national environmental group in Heartland area, operating out of Oklahoma in a 5-state area. So I attended these meetings and was part of this creation of the environmental justice movement. At the same time, through this movement, the Indigenous Environmental Network was organized by Tom Goldtooth, who's an old friend of mine. And we had the first Protecting Mother Earth gathering in South Dakota in 1991 at this time as well. And Indigenous Environmental Network is still a very strong organization in North America. Next slide. So the outcome of all of this organizing led to the executive order that we've heard about in 1994 by President Clinton, which stands as the only real federal response to all of this effort at this time, and still remains as our only legal option at this point. And we heard from Alberto how the agencies have responded to this executive order. And the EPA's response has led to general assistance project or program grants for the tribal environmental offices. I was a environmental program director for the Quapaw Nation back in 1997. I started their environmental office with one of these GAP grants. And the EPA also offers EJ grants to community groups. I've written quite a few of these grants and gotten some of those. My organization in Oklahoma, we have utilized this methodology to get our entire county designated as an EJ community. And also the EPA established the NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which has been going since 1993 and is still active today. Next slide. So those are all the gains that we made through all of that organizing. So we've heard from the lawyers, the legal side of this. I just wanted to emphasize how you get there, because this conference is about, you know, how organizing impacts policy. And so this is what I wanted to emphasize by showing from the past how organizing got us here. Okay, so where are we? Where we are is we have the executive order, and we have these efforts by the agencies, like Alberto talked about it through his agency, his efforts. You can see, you know, the EPA and their efforts. However, what does that really translate to for our organizations on the ground, our communities? And I can tell you, as someone operating on the grassroots level all the way up to national and international level through grassroots networks, that it's slipping away. And that's what I really wanted to emphasize, is that our rights are slipping away quickly because of the permitting process. That's how corporations are fighting back. And so we're losing right to know, and we're losing our abilities to impact permits through the permitting process. Permits are already approved before public comment happens. On the tribal level, free, prior, informed consent, as it's practiced in the United States and Canada, means yes, and informed means not much. It just means a phone call, a letter. It can mean very little, and consent means we're coming. The EPA regional offices have been pretty much consolidated. Tribal offices with EJ offices, and the tribes are getting the attention while the EJ groups are being thrown under the bus. This has been our experience. And EJ is not being considered in permitting. The original definition of EJ was that our groups would not, our communities would not receive additional toxic burdens, and that's not being considered. Next slide. And so what we need is Superfund Reauthorization. Tribes need the right to say no to extractive industries, mining oil, gas, uranium on indigenous lands. FPIC, as defined by the UN, needs to be enforced by the United States, and we need to codify environmental justice. That's been attempted in the Congress. The Fed doesn't have the will to codify environmental justice. And we need to strengthen right to know and toxic release inventory. I'm finding when I write comments for a permit for an existing facility, there's a vast difference between what they report in toxic release inventory and what their permits say they are allowed to release. There's always a vast difference. And my question is always, are they honest in what they're releasing based on what they're allowed to release? With that vast difference, what are we actually being exposed to? Vermont signed their EJ law without funding. So this is our next steps, is we need funding. We need to establish an environmental justice board that represents our environmental justice communities. And we know that effort is underway now. We have several groups in Vermont that are environmental justice oriented, BIPOC groups, and our other larger groups support that. So we need to really keep that effort going, targeted at the state, to ensure that Vermont becomes a model of it for environmental justice, codified. If we have to codify environmental justice one state at a time, then so be it. We can do this until we get enough states on board that the Fed finally responds. If that's what it takes, that's what we'll have to do. And direct consultation with the Abenaki bands on EJ, that's not happening. So this is what I propose that we do in Vermont until we can get this across the board in the United States. But these are the issue areas that I see that we need to strengthen, and we need a lot of organizing on. And with that, I would just say, Willimini Wado, thank you.
Thank you, Earl, for dialing us back and really bringing us to the grassroots level. That's part of the goal in our discussion today, is just exploring both the policy and how it affects those on the ground. So thank you for laying the groundwork. Thank you to all of our panelists for panel one. We don't have any questions in the chat, but I would like to pose a general question to all of our panelists. And it's that I think it's commonly understood that the Biden administration hasn't done much when it comes to environmental justice, and it's really in name only, not supported by action. What would you suggest he can do in the next 2.5 years, or the administration can do to further environmental justice principles on a national level? Anyone can start.
Yeah, I would say, I would like to jump in and just say that I see a lot of lip service with EJ, but they're not dialoguing with the grassroots. They're not dialoguing with us. And we need to establish that dialogue, and they need to take it serious. And I don't see a serious effort to codify EJ. The administration needs to be nailing Congress and getting that passed. And until we get it codified, we're going to be in the wilderness on this.
I guess I'll just echo what Earl said so eloquently, just nailed it on the head. Really, is a lot of lip service coming from the Biden administration. What we've been seeing is, like Earl had mentioned in his presentation, states taking on this responsibility where the federal government has been failing. So like, for example, this year, New York State passed its first green amendment, right? So a constitutional right to healthy air and healthy environment. And I think until we get to a point where we're just gonna flat out say, there are no more placement of toxins in overburdened communities, like the permits will be denied if you are in an overburdened community, then we're really not going to come to terms with how environmental racism impacts BIPOC communities. And also until we start doing some real mitigation in those communities, it's all just lip service. And so while they're acknowledging that historically these actions have happened, there's a lack of acknowledgement that it's still happening, it's continuing to happen, it's going to happen tomorrow, unless we take some real action in codifying it as a constitutional right to clean air, healthy environment, and then also just flat out denying any permit for cumulative impacts around BIPOC communities, and then beginning a real remediation effort. And I also like to tie this into reparations work. I think environmental justice has a designated line item in reparations when we're talking about trying to build policies and cash payments for communities that have been historically disenfranchised, specifically Black communities. We need to be framing that environmental justice is a reparations issue, and there needs to be some adequate funding to eliminate those areas in all BIPOC communities.
Sure, Alberto, please.
Yeah, last year, White House presented the Executive Order of Justice 40. It's Executive Order 14008 that requires, it is related to climate change, but it's also related to environmental justice, that it requires federal institutions to increase their efforts to enforce and apply and implement new practices for environmental justice. So we are waiting to federal institutions to start developing new public policies to see how that will go, how those new strategies will be implemented. Something very good from that executive order from the White House is that they established certain new requirements or certain new involvement from the General Attorney of the United States in the enforcement of environmental justice. How that is going to be, I'm not sure. I'm expecting, I would like to see that maybe the environmental justice, the General Attorney requires some kind of liability to public institutions when they enforce environmental justice, or at least give communities the possibility or the alternative to present any kind of research or against public institutions when they do not do any kind of an effective environmental justice assessment. As I mentioned before, Executive Order 1298, even though is the only resource that we have, is not the best one. No one has the alternative to present a complaint against agencies for not doing environmental justice assessment. So with this executive order, if, and we are waiting for that, General Attorney decides to maybe create certain guidelines or certain research for communities, organizations to go against public institutions for not doing environmental justice, I think that will be something good in the near future, and something that make the Executive Order 1298 and a little bit stronger. Another thing I would say, and this is more like into the Congress more than in the executive area, I would say there's been like over the decades some movements or some intentions about amending the National Policy Environmental Act. As you know, we have the NEPA reviews that are required in NEPA when we are doing a specific project. However, NEPA doesn't require to do environmental justice assessment. So if we make certain push or something advocacy or certain lobbying to make that amendment into the NEPA that include environmental justice assessment when we are doing NEPA review, that's something will improve also the enforcement and implementation of environmental justice assessment in nationwide.
Thank you, everyone. We do have one question from Claire Valentin Foster, who asks, do you think we need an across-the-board definition of EJ, or is it best to leave it state by state? She's thinking about how broad the definition of disadvantaged community is with Justice 40. Can anyone answer that question?
Yeah, I think we will need a definition. If we're going to get it codified on the federal level, there will need to be a definition. States may modify that state by state until we do have a federal definition. But I do think we need a definition. The original definition that EPA had, I thought, was strong and good, and it included that people of color and low income would not receive a disproportionate share of toxic burdens. That has been now taken out and it's no longer part of their definition. I would like to see that put back in and see that state by state, that's in all of their definitions, however they word it, that be in there. And I'd like to see that on the federal level when the Fed finally gets around to it.
I absolutely agree. I think there is a need for a federal definition, and this is always a reminder that just because there's not an either or, just because the federal government defines it does not mean the states can't also define it. I mean, there's a couple of rules around it. Obviously, the state can't go more broader than the federal government, but they can certainly go stricter. And I think if we're talking about on a state level, the federal government would be great guidance to determining what the definition would be. If the definition is a good definition, if it's a terrible definition, then depending on what state you're in, they can decide they want to go a lot stronger on that definition. But we certainly need at least a foundation of what this means to be in an environmental justice community.
Wonderful. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Claire, for your insightful question. I guess now it's time to introduce our keynote speaker. I will take a moment to give you guys a little bit more detail about Tamara. She is an internationally recognized advocate and climate strategist. Her work focuses on people and planet. Her niche in environmental work is developing high impact programs and multimedia campaigns to dismantle privilege and increase opportunities for vulnerable populations to access healthy air, clean energy, and a toxic-free environment and economy at the local, the regional, and the national level. Tamara is sought after across various sectors for her thoughtful leadership on environmental work and her support of equitable climate change action. Among her many activities, she is founder of Climate Critical Earth, which is a visionary new organization that is supporting the next generation of climate leadership. She's an advisory board member at Climate Refugees and senior advisor to the Green Leadership Trust, which builds a more powerful environmental movement by expanding the leadership of Black, Indigenous people of color on US environmental nonprofit boards. Tamara is a strategic advisor to the Yale Center of Environmental Justice and a member of the World Economic Forum, Global Future Council's Executive Working Group. She also serves on the advisory board of Climate Power 2020, where she provides insight on issues of political impact of climate change. Just last year in June, Tamara was appointed president and CEO of the Environmental Grantmakers Association. But most importantly, Tamara graduated from Vermont Law School in 2009 with her Juris Doctor and Master of Environmental Law and Policy with a concentration in energy generation and carbon constraint. I had the pleasure of hearing Tamara speak last summer when she gave her talk to Vermonters and Vermont students titled Revelations on Justice and Next Generation Environmentalism, which included a discussion of equitable, accessible, and long-term approaches to justice and climate policy. Ever since that talk, I knew I wanted to invite her back. And of course, this symposium gave us the perfect opportunity to do that. So it is my great honor to introduce Tamara Toleso Lachlan.
Hi, Christine. Hi, everyone. Good late morning from New York, the Lapping land. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And this is just a picture of a street where not far from where I live. That just a reminder to everyone that we're in a very strange time. After many years of strange time, we're still in it. I would like to give honor to Earl and Lanessa and Alberto, who went before me to talk about so much of the work, and I am only here to add some texture to that conversation. It feels like we are in the middle of many important moments, and I want to talk a little bit about what I think the secret ingredient is for us to to make it through this transition in a position where people are given opportunity and tools and networks to continue. So I'm just gonna add, I'm gonna share my screen just so that I can do a better job of sharing a lot of information all at once. So give me just 2 seconds to set up my screen. Hold on just one moment.
You're muted, Tamara. I can see your screen, but you're still muted.
Hi, everyone. So the technical difficulties would suggest to me that we're doing something really important. That's what my mother would say, that if there's been this many barriers to our technology, it means we must be doing something folks are interested in. I'm gonna, like I said, add to what I think is a really rich tapestry of where we are. And I am an eternal optimist because I don't expect that the work that has to be done will be done only by me. In fact, I live in the middle of someone else's big plans, and when I leave this world, it'll be the middle of someone else's big plans. And so when you start to look at time as gone 200 or 300 years in either direction, and you're just doing your part, it feels a lot less personal. I want to talk a little bit about who I am. Christine did a really fantastic job of lifting up my relationship to this space. I think that VLS is a particularly special place where people come to bring the tools they have to the work that the communities they care about and make better things happen. So here are a few of my core values. As you can tell from already, humor is a big part of how I make it through this work. Otherwise, it's really just depressing stuff. This community, VLS, means so much to me, having graduated in 2009 with 25 really amazing friends and about 275 folks I would definitely save in a fire. So it feels like being able to go back to that community for relationships and information, for the building of adaptive frameworks and coalitions across the places that we've landed is a big part of any success that I'm able to have on behalf of my community. I do this work in a few different places, and I wanted to share information on some of those places. The letters in Black are the mission statements of those places, and what you see in green is what I'm doing there. Recognize that I'm just one part of the work of each of these different places. And some of the speakers today already touched on the idea that we have to build the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We have to harmonize our work and align to fundamentally transform our economic and political systems. And if we try to do that work without recognizing that the legal grounds and the data is shifting at a rate that's as fast as climate change is changing everything else, we will leave out the international parts of our community, which include every single tribal community, which represents an entirely different government. We're not talking about US law because the US came after Indigenous nations were already here. So just wanted to lift up that. You'll probably see this kind of stuff. You'll see me on the internet quite a bit, but I want to talk like the small group that we are about what's really important and not just what you can find in less than 300 characters. My other role at Environmental Grantmakers Association is really trying to do organizing work at the level of the folks who make investments in what our work will be, who are largely responsible for the context and precepts of our work to date. So whatever state it's in, there are a lot of folks to have a conversation about that, and they're still here. So I'm happy to be someone who's holding on some of pieces of that and lift up the work of Climate Critical Earth, which is a safe haven space for folks who are actively engaged in this work. It is difficult, it is grinding. It really does make you wonder, why didn't you just choose to do the evil thing? Because it's just so difficult. And so really forming places where we can practice together, build out communities where we do the healthier thing in the longer run for the largest number of us is a practice. So happy to talk about that after this moment. But I also want to lift up that we are wrestling with a design problem. And it is my theory of action and the reason I get up every day that we will not be able to make a dent in what has been described by the others who've gone before me as the system that does not work for us unless we recognize that that design must be met with redesign. And you all are the folks that are going to need to do that. So no pressure, but a lot to do. My part of it is to make sure that that work is global, anti-racist, celebratory, and as a through line of accountability, because no relationships can be formed unless we form them as people who care about each other. So today I want to talk about how each of us and the folks who will watch this subsequently are carving out their own path to social justice and where that fits in what Earl started to lay out about some of the events that we hold as our benchmarks as Black, Indigenous, and people of color doing this work. The landscape we face is plenty. Zoning abuse and community erasure. Lanessa talked quite a bit about that, about what it means to fight disinformation and eco-fascism, what it means to fight rights regression. You made my ears perk up when you talked about the Green Amendment as the person whose organization held that space for Maryland's continuing a fight about whether or not we will have a Green Amendment. It really is a powerful tool to do what other places have done, which is put environmental rights as a fundamental part of your personhood. And so flagging that we don't have that, we have this instead, this hot mess. Even before we had president number 45, when people feel like it all fell down, Earl started to talk about some of the tools that we built getting worn away, the toxics release inventory. I happened to work with some of the folks who designed it and worked on it when I was in Colorado at the EPA, watching them trying to make the data tell the story that communities have been telling about what's happening to them. So well before we were in Trump-related hostility, we were already in a place where we didn't solve for highways and air pollution, energy demand and clean energy. Yes, in my backyard, and the choir of no in my backyard, and even this moment of electrification and storage. These are problems we've had for a long time. And everyone who comes through BLS has the rare opportunity, unlike so many folks in this work, to get a real close-up look at how this robust set of environmental laws that have been fashioned as a fabric in defense by the people, for the people, leveraging the government to make change, is one of the most powerful sets of laws that has ever existed to try to create some space between what industry and its co-conspirators would do to take away rights and land from people and planet. So there's a lot missing from the story. And my colleagues that spoke previously started to touch on it. I want to add a little bit more color. So the things that we are fighting for, we have been fighting for since Turtle Island became America. The idea that the Indian Removal Act isn't an act of war and an act of aggression from one entity to another that creates so many kinds of war that leads right to this moment. If we were to look over that, we would fail to see how many of us have been fighting, and it makes you feel like you're alone in doing your work. So I wanted to lay out this sort of quick and dirty pathway of all the ways that this entire government, the US government, has worked to crush the needs, voices, and the capacity of different communities, so many of us, that there should be very few people that aren't fighting for their rights. You can't find your community in this checkerboard of folks who've been targeted by the government for suppression. You are not looking hard enough. and I'll flag that one thing that folks really miss is that the Servicemen's Adjustment Bill Act, or the GI Bill, has impacts in the same way racially restrictive covenants, so that one could argue that slavery itself did not end until 1965 if people weren't able to use their resources or their wealth or have access to benefits that were supposedly open to tons of folks. So we're not talking about so much time. There are folks whose great grandparents were slaves who are still alive. We are not talking about past injustices. We're talking about today's moment. But there's other things that are missing that make it less distressing. So the history that we started to touch on across this conversation, and will continue after I am done, is about this timeline, this patchwork. Earl talked about the People of Color's Leadership Summit 1 and 2 and all the events that happen in between. There's the swap letter. There's so many different parts of our history that are not taught in public schools and education. So people feel like the fight has only ever happened in defense mode, not in offensive mode. Communities have been gathering to talk about where we're experiencing harm, make plans to fight that, and build in pathways to protect the culture as they do it, as long as there have been people. This timeline is not exclusive, and there's lots of other things that have happened in parallel all over the planet at the same time, but this is the US pathway through what the United States government has been doing, and has taken so many different kinds of people. So what we've been left with are racist standards, cultural norms of oppression, suppressed silence, and falsely limited technical responses to things that are about people and planet. And I want to flag that as much as I am spent way too much of my, no, not way too much, all of my waking hours in the master's program in the MELP and the librarian stacks focusing on energy generation and transmission, innovation alone is not going to be what saves us. There are people who have done this work, people who have been in relationship with other folks whose names you should know, whose work you should follow, many of whom died in service of the work or died because they spent so much time carrying it at a level that's disproportionate to the amount of harm that people should face. So recognizing that Damu Smith is the name of a person you should know. I'm going to talk about some folks I think who are really important, whose energy is still with us. One of the founding members of the National Black Environmental Justice Network, which still exists, full of people who are still alive, really was an architect of this work, who made plans for us to talk about war, police brutality, apartheid, hunger, oppressive governmental policies, and industrial pollution. If we have solved for any of that, I would be surprised to hear about it and would like to come to your talk. Also want to lift up the name of Dana Alston, movement convener, strategist, advocate, and friend to many folks who are also still doing great work in the struggle, helping to bring her work to the forefront. She helped to convene the Environmental Leadership Summit, and she was one of the early architects of the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which was launched just a few years ago. And to flag for folks who are really getting excited about the next COP and what they can or cannot do at the People's COP, she also led a delegation of EJ leaders to participate in the 1992 Earth Summit, which is the forerunner of so many of these global conversations around the environment. Whether or not they are effective is another set of questions, but here she is, a real life person who did this work, who added her life to it and passed away too soon. Cecil Corbin Mark, this is particularly painful for me because Cecil was one of my favorite people to get into a fight with, even when we agreed about stuff. As a New Yorker, as a person who often watched him show up in a dapper outfit and argue the mess out of everyone, he would often pull aside Black and brown legally trained people and go, "Why aren't you in the courts every single day? That's what you should be doing with your work. We need more laws behind us." He was an organizer, a lobbyist, and a strategist. He demanded justice for our community and worked out on his own in Harlem. You could find him anywhere in the world where there was problems. And he spent so much of his life fighting for things that are still being realized. And he passed away too soon, just a year ago. So Charles Lee, the Toxic Waste and Race the Toxic Waste and Race in the United States paper that came out really is a founding document for the work of environmental justice, not because it wasn't happening, but as Earl pointed out, it started to create some benchmarks for where we wanted to go, the kinds of leadership we wanted to see, and a relationship that poor people wanted to have with the government that's supposed to serve them. So wanted to lift up that this work has always been Black, Indigenous, and people of color against the system, building their own ways of working. He's a charter member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which is a forerunner to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. Folks on the NEJAC built the WEJAC for better and worse with its new head at Jalon White Newsom of WEAC. There are so many threads of our past work, our present work, and that leadership still pushing for change in this moment. And just one more reason that you shouldn't feel like it's just you. Ralph Abascal, advocate and defender of farm workers' rights, was an attorney and a defender from his birth to his death. He fought against and argued the case against DDT and pesticides in California's fields and orchards. Little do we all know that the industry is apt to create so many more poisons before we can finish counting them, that Tosca would become a mess of attempts to try to capture the industry as it continues to ensnare us in scientific jargon and regulations. But this work started over 30 years ago in Ralph's name and as a legal services advisor at the California Rural Legal Assistance. There are folks on this call who could talk about this better than I could, Caroline. Nice to see you in the group, but really just want to lift up that this work is ongoing. It is evolving. It involves people who care about other folks. Nice to see you raise your hand virtually, Caroline. Sheila Foster, another person who's still alive, still exists. She really is Sheila Foster is a trailblazer and a scholar in environmental and climate justice, flagging that she is still doing work not far away from where you are now. Many of you are located. She has been an author of a number of books, wrote an incredible field guide that people have used, Ground Up Environmental Racism and the Rise of Environmental Justice Movement, which was one of the first books I was handed by Luke Cole, who is also a function of this conversation. So just want to lift up that movement innovator, original environmental justice lawyer. I would call him an OG environmental justice lawyer, one of the few people I ever wanted to be like in my entire career. He could pester you in ways that felt really soft about things that you should do. And he had a lot of really great things that he would say about how the work happened, a lot of provocations to help people think about their role in the work, what it meant to take privilege and move that into a useful space in service to other folks. So he said a lot of things, but I captured a couple of them. He told young lawyers not to take any actions unless you recognize that you could educate people, whether you were using all of your credentials to educate, to build the movement, or to get to the root of the problem. We will call that social determinants of health, power building, and straight up education. All of those are really important questions as you move out of academia. The other three things that he said, he directed specifically at white America's view of its role in this work. And I thought that it was so powerful, I wanted to just leave it here for a minute. Because as each of us consider why it is we have invested our careers in doing this work, what we really need to be asking is, what are we setting ourselves up to do and for whom? Really powerful set of folks who have been doing this work, and I wanted to honor them as we move into Juneteenth, because the groundwork for so much of what we have been doing was laid by people who left their lives in service to these same principles. In my own time and education in this space, I have become a practitioner thinking about my own relationship to environmental justice. Lanessa talked about the time that it takes to build a coalition, how hard it is to get people to continue to hold the line, especially when they're not treated as partners. And so in goading the EPA to change its definition of environmental justice over many years, I have, among others, pushed for us to recognize as a people that what the federal government does with environmental justice is not necessarily what communities would want to have happen, even if it's well-intentioned. And so pushing out this redefinition of informed and ongoing engagement between impacted people and decision makers, as though we were partners to determine the fair distribution and benefits, and if any acceptable burdens. So lifting up that what the EPA does is about the EPA's assets, and what we do is about our community. I also want to flag something that if I don't say it, people will wonder what happened to me. Corporate bodies do not do justice work, but they can do it with a focus on equity. I say this talking to the Environmental Justice Law Society, because the mechanism by which the law allows us to have access to things that should be basic rights is very different than the other players in the room, the government stakeholders, the industry, who is increasingly making its own divisions amongst itself between folks who are for people, who want to be driven by profit models that support folks, and those that do not. So one way to distinguish where you spend your life and career and service should be this question of, are they selling you that what they're going to do is justice work? Are they appropriately looking at their role as being able to develop equity in service of justice work? Equity itself is a practice that requires us to habitually refocus the resources we have access to and the norms we accept to support the folks who are at risk in any given action, and make sure that we are shifting our policies, our practice, and our activities to avoid those harms. That is a really dangerous thing to do with your life and your career and your work. And it's one of the more fun things, if I could say so very frankly. Asking who is harmed, who's erased, and who's left out of this conversation will derail just about any plan that ever gets brought up if the work is about suppression rather than liberative practice. So happy to talk to each of you about all of this and your takes on it and hear about how you've been working on it. But I also want to lift up, despite some of the discussion that happened earlier, I do think that so much of the work that has happened has made an impact and that it would be worse. I'll even go further and say that the current moment we're in, where the Biden-Harris administration is holding to the word, if not the deed, on environmental justice, is about recognizing what that mechanism can do versus what it cannot do. Both things that have been powerful that have come from the Biden and Harris administration at this moment is the recognition that health, economic, racial, and educational justice is meaningless without environmental justice. Not anyone else who's ever sat in that chair in the White House has ever admitted this thing we all know to be true. So whether or not we are getting everything we asked for, or even whether we're going to stop asking, which I would suggest we do not, I think we need to become louder and broader and wider and more demanding. But lifting up that not everyone who's inside is not someone who has not come from, there are many folks who've come from our community who are seeing their service going into the administration as a place where they do that work. They obviously didn't talk to me about it, but I want to lift up that we are not alone in doing this work in the places where we find ourselves. Their commitment to all of government on climate and environmental justice, the Justice 40, NEJAC, WEJAC, the chair on the Council of Environmental Quality, Brenda Mallory, Jalone White Newsom. These are people who have spent a lot of time thinking about systems failure. And as much as we would like to make a quick pronouncement about what's happening and what isn't, it might be better for our movement if we engage them, because they are us. I also want to lift up that there's some really interesting legal language that's important for lawyers in this space trying to get under the hood, and Justice 40 has various tomes come out of the federal government explaining what it does. 40% of the benefits of government expenditures will flow to disadvantaged communities. There are appropriately negative feelings across the board about removing a racial equity lens and putting in the words disadvantaged communities. But the other thing that's happening there is that 40% of benefits, not 40% of dollars. That's a much bigger number if we start to calculate it. And I dare us to do just that. At this moment, sitting here as we are having this conversation, the U.S. Office of Management and Budget has calculated $29 billion of federal money that's left the federal government, that's moving currently in our system, is already earmarked to meet Justice 40 criteria. So while there aren't giant bills that look like great stuff, there's the everyday business of procurement and regulation and where federal money goes that is quietly dripping through the cracks, and to the tune of real money, even in inflation America. So I just want to lift up that we have to balance the things we need to do with the stuff that's already happening and create a flank that really does support more proof of concept. I also want to flag that it's not just on those of us who are on the practitioner side. The branches of government are pretty pitiful, and every time we get a win, it's nice to sit back and think about that. As the CEO and president of the Environmental Grantmakers Association, it was my absolute pleasure to be the only environmental advocacy organization that would sponsor the kickoff for our new Supreme Court justices' ascension to the federal bench. So to the highest bench in the country. So I just want to lift up that, like, it's not all going to terribly. What's our next move? Well, I'm gonna ask a rhetorical question since we're not quite in dialogue yet, and say our next move is you. Reimagining your career as a vehicle for redesign, stepping up to deliver, which means the job you take, the alliances you make, the relationships you have, and the demands that you set when you show up in the room as a leader who lends you a service to the community. That means your practice, your own procedure, and the policies that you help to support by listening deeply to folks who have needs and have expertise about what they're experiencing. You really can move the ideals of what matters to us today into the laws of the future. And that's not a thing you should give up on just because it's looking a little gross. I mean, I'll be honest, climate Twitter is pretty sad. So I want to lift up that part of the reason why we need you is because there are a bunch of really great ideas on the table and a lot of tired folks who need help moving it. So the idea of divestment came to us in South Africa, moved through environment and climate, and is now a real wedge for moving dollars to stop wars and to end oppression. But only if we keep pushing for it as though it is a strategy that works alongside other strategies. The folks who are doing it are tired, they need more people. It was really exciting to hear Christine, Lanessa, and other folks talk about the work of reparations, the place of environmental justice and reparations, land back, the call for fossil fuel non-proliferation, which is really, really a roadmap for how we stop doing bad things and in what order we do them. So lots of really smart people fought for a Green New Deal, for better and for worse, in the ways that I would do it and not. I also want to lift up that we're going to pay for jobs, infrastructure, and human health, regardless of what we call it. So as Green New Deal fades out of the nomenclature as language, look for work that's supporting jobs, infrastructure, and people, reparations, land back, and non-proliferation, and you're already in that fight. Hold on just one moment. I'm just gonna stop that bell from ringing. Excuse me for just one. I look forward to being able to give a keynote in real time in the future, because then the bell that goes off will be someone asking me to get off stage, not to answer my door. So I want to talk to you about the Black climate agenda because I'm clearly, obviously, and unapologetically Black. So I figured it'd be a good time to talk about that. The reason why I think it's important for us to name it and to claim it. The Latinx climate agenda is on the way, by the way. So folks know that we have never done this work alone, nor will we, but really laying out what it will take and putting on the public agenda, a schedule for our liberation is important work and will require every kind of person in order to make it successful. The reason I'm focused on a Black agenda is because these sad facts are still true. More than 1 million African Americans live within half a mile of a natural gas facility, even in Joe Biden's America, where we pump out more oil and gas than we have historically. Even as we talk, the talking points sound like they are about wind and energy and hydro and geothermal and all the questions we'll have to wrestle with around that. 1 million African Americans still face a cancer risk above that of others just because of polluted air, old school bread and butter issues of clean air, clean water, and access to services. African Americans are 75% more likely than their white counterparts to live near things that kill you. And we're not the only ones, but we're a really small part of the population. And to be facing such risk at this time with this much technology is a sign that the system is designed to make these outcomes true. We need allies in every part of the work, and your career, your education, your relationships, and your love for your community will be what helps you to change these statistics. So people have asked me in the media and elsewhere, what is the Black climate agenda? It's everything that has to be done to make sure there are Black people in the future. That's the agenda. I wish it was more complicated than that. I wish it didn't have to be so expansive, but frankly, we are under threat, and I cannot in good conscience, pretend that we don't have to plan for our survival in order for it to be assured. Largely because, like our Black, Indigenous, and people of color have known forever, none of us should bear an outsized burden of environmental threats, ecological manipulation, or be excluded from decisions that determine our future, and certainly not for money. Because poverty is not natural, nor is it biological. It is a function of design, which means we have to be engaged in redesigning it. Here are a couple of things I think we might start doing to begin that conversation. And I would be happy to have a conversation with all of you about power shifting and power sharing, restorative justice, and why money is imperfect, but we still have to demand it. So happy to talk to you about any of that as you build your credentials, connect with the folks who have been at this for a really long time, who are still here, by the way, assess the power dynamics in every room you are in, and then put your skills to work for folks who need you, who are you, and who will be erased without your efforts. The most important thing I can ask of you as we think about the power that you hold as folks who are doing this work is to make sure that the work is low ego and high impact, because there are lots of egos and none of them help us win. At the rate at which ego is moving the work, it might be easier to go work for the opposition unless you actually willing to put your ego down, the credentials and that you believe might be the reason why you have a license to do this work, and recognize that impact at the speed of trust with communities alongside of you is the most powerful thing you could do with your work. And on that note, I will stop because we have a lot to do and we should probably get busy doing it together. And I'd love to have some time to talk about that. And I'll stop screen sharing if that's okay.
Thank you, Tamara, for putting today's discussion into perspective. I know we kind of jumbled the schedule a little bit, but you incorporated what we talked about so seamlessly, and I appreciate you for that. I don't know if anyone has any questions for Tamara, but I had asked you this, I think, the last time, and I wonder if your answer has changed. If there's a real way to achieve equity in government, looking at how, I think you mentioned looking at finances will definitely help, but on the grassroots level, how do you bridge that gap? Oh, Tamara's gone. I think that's the conversation that we're going to continue throughout today's discussion. Our next speaker is Abel Luna, who's coming to us from Migrant Justice. Migrant Justice is an organization that is founded and led by immigrant farm workers in Vermont who advance and advocate for migrant workers and their rights, not just in Vermont, but across the country. Since 2009, the organization has led a number of groundbreaking campaigns for human rights and economic justice. And most recently, they have been working on their Milk with Dignity campaign, which is a worker-driven program that ensures human rights for farm workers in the dairy industry. Abel is the organizer and education coordinator for Migrant Justice, and I'm going to pass it along to him as we move along with the program today.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Abel Luna. I'm an organizer for Migrant Justice. I've been with the organization for about 9 years. As it was mentioned, Migrant Justice is an organization based out of Burlington, Vermont. It was built and it's led by migrant farm workers, migrant dairy farm workers milking cows in the dairy farms here in Vermont. Just a little bit of the context, Migrant Justice was started after the death of a young farm worker named Jose Obed Santos Cruz from Chiapas, Mexico, when he was 19 years old on a workplace accident on a farm. And that was the beginning of the organization, when people started talking about migrant workers maintaining and sustaining the dairy industry here in Vermont. Since then we've been organizing to transform and change the reality that people are facing on dairy farms. On the question of what does it mean to center BIPOC voices, in shaping environmental policy, I think in our experience and for us, it's very simple. it's following the leadership of the experts, and by that, by experts, we mean the communities, that are most impacted by the issues at hand, and also by the decisions that are being made without other voices being at the table. A lot of the times, the process, the different processes, for example, are open for people or for our communities to come in and to share our experience and how are we impacted by the issues at hand. Very little, there's spaces to talk about, what can we do, to take leadership from these groups to actually change the reality that people are facing. And take leadership from the organizing, because these communities already know best, and they have already envisioned a way forward, to transform those issues at hand, or the reality that they're facing. A lot of the times, what ends up happening is, we open up the spaces, and communities are saying, hey, we need a better transportation system because we're poor, and having a better buses, or better way to get to to the hospital, or better way to get to the store, or better way to get to bring my kids to school, or some of those sort of basic necessities, right? And then in return we get electric pumps, or electric chargers on the highways to charge Teslas, right? That's not gonna, it's not gonna go anywhere. So I think how do we incorporate those voices that are most affected, right? And also allowing authentic participation. It's important. Otherwise, like I mentioned, nothing is going to work. For example, going electric, it's important, but it means nothing. When communities cannot get to the doctor, or have the ability to buy healthy food and stuff like that. So it's important. Going electric, but if we're truly talking about centering the voices of BIPOC people, then that's not the solution, right? The solution is we need a better transportation system to take care of our most basic needs. If another example is if we're for example putting up solar panels, right? And we're saying, yeah, this is great for the environment, and this is the best thing that we can do. We need to ask ourselves how many working class people are actually going to be putting up solar panels in their apartments, right? Or in the trailers, when they're really worried about sort of the high prices of rent, or the high prices of gas or electricity, right? And so, how about listening to those communities, that probably have already envisioned a solution, and probably the solution is, having a fight against the electric companies to bring the prices down, or the fight against the landlords to bring sort of rent down, right? And so I think when we're so what I'm trying to say is that people already know what they need and what they want. They already have their solutions, right? And it's like we're saying, okay, we're trying to do this, and we're trying to center the voices of BIPOC people, and it's really not happening. We need to be intentional, and we need to have we taking leadership from groups that are already doing the organizing and the work that needs to be done. And for migrant communities here in Vermont, that are milking cows in dairy farms. Many of the majority of the community are coming from communities in Mexico where they were displaced from their home countries or their communities because of unjust policies, or privatization of the land, or pollution of the land to the point where they cannot grow food any longer, and they need to migrate, right? And sort of that very same system that kicks them out of their land and their communities, turns us into a criminal when you're here, because you don't have a paper that says welcome to the United States, but at the same time needs our work, right? And so, that is sort of why, bringing back sort of to how I started, the fight that we have here in Vermont with migrant justice, from that reality that people are facing on the farms. For example, transportation, what's important for us, having a driver license, just the ability and the right to move freely without being detained or, being pulled over by border patrol or the police and then deported. And so, having a policy that that protected us against that was important, right? And so, again, taking leadership and listening to the communities that are already doing the work, it's important, and not just sort of running up and believing that we're the experts and we know everything. And so I think that I just wanted to bring that to the conversation a little bit.
Thank you, Abel. I wanted to ask you, is there a way that the students at Vermont Law School or the general public can partner with your organization, and how can we promote the work that you're doing on the ground in Vermont?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that people can get involved. If you can go to migrantjustice.net, that is our website. And there's a lot of, one of the ways that, although we have a driver license in Vermont, we always need, our rights to, get people from the farm to a meeting, or the farm to, the DMV to get a driver license, and those are some different ways. And, we have a campaign, Meal with Dignity campaign, calling on Hannah Forge to join onto the Meal with Dignity program. And so if you want our website, there's a lot of different ways to get involved and learn a little bit more, but again, that is directly tied to, living with dignity and respect in the dairy farms. And it's directly tied to the issue of, how do we support the work that people are doing already, that people of color are already doing.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for sharing your website. We had one of our general body members insert that into the chat for everyone so they can access it freely. Thank you again, Abel, for your expertise and for explaining how climate policy directly impacts grassroots organizers such as yourself. I would like to move ahead and introduce our second panel, which will discuss how environmental justice stakeholders can equitably redistribute resources. Our panelists include Tracy Lewis, who is Policy Counsel for Climate and Energy Program Public Citizen. We have Anthony Rogers Wright, who is Director of Environmental Justice Projects at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and Sherry White Williamson, who is Environmental Justice Policy Director at North Carolina Conservation Network. They will discuss the Justice 40 approach, some of the benefits of that approach and its failings, and offer some suggestions for a more nuanced approach to climate justice that pursues equity-centered solutions. So it is my pleasure to introduce Tracy Lewis. I believe Tracy and Anthony will be doing a shared presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Christine, I just want to say thank you so much to you and all of your classmates. One, congrats on your graduations. I just want everyone to know that these students and now recent alumni have been doing this work while they are also studying for the bar, or I'm sure some of you are rising 3Ls. So the work that you've done is pretty incredible, because I know when I was at VLS, if you would ask me to make you a slice of toast, I would have run screaming. So thank you so much. And also I just want to say that I'm very proud VLS alum with my esteemed colleague and wonderful dear friend and classmate, Tamara. 09, we're the best. Well, 22, you're pretty cool too. But really happy to be here with all of you, and it's I hope we all stay connected. Anthony and I, we're going to do our little road show because we work together here in DC and we work on so many similar issues. So Anthony, I just want to turn to you so you can introduce yourself too.
Great, thanks so much, Tracy. And yeah, definitely thank you, Christine, for all of your work and getting this together. I'm Anthony Creeper Rogers Wright, as was just said. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm from New York City, but currently residing in occupied Piscataway territory, Washington, DC, soon to be known hopefully as the Douglas Commonwealth. We'll talk about that some other time. As I'm actually not an attorney, I kind of say that with pride, but no shade. Black swans or swans for and you know, I think what I do is I really try to synergize or create context between, you know, what's happening at the federal level and what's happening at the state level. I sit on the steering committee of a 320 coalition member coalition called New York Renews, which was very integral in securing ratification of what's some describe as the most aggressive piece of climate policy in the country, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which of course is the impetus for what they're doing at the federal level and so-called Justice 40. So I think I'll stop there with the introduction, but it's great to be here.
It would help if I took myself off mute. Well, you know, I wanted to get us rolling a little bit, and Anthony, I will start by asking you to probably extend your thoughts a little bit more on some of the pitfalls of the Justice 40 program as laid out by the administration, and folks aren't familiar with it. Maybe I hope we can put something, or you can Google Justice 40 and you'll be sad. But if you could maybe get us started, giving just a little context to it and explaining why it is not working the way that so many of our organizations thought it would.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think our mutually esteemed colleague Tamara, you know, touched on the issue of the CEQ's decision to approach Justice 40 and environmental justice with a race-neutral lens. I contend that there's never been a race-neutral policy in the history of, you know, present-day United States that has benefited non-white people. I mean, we can go back to the so-called New Deal, which for us was a raw deal, which in a way is kind of why we're here talking about environmental justice communities in large part because of the redlining that took place as part of many of the programs or pogroms associated with the New Deal. So, but also I think that, again, I'm not an attorney. I think it was a bit like craven and languorous because we do have some case law, including parents involved, where Justice Kennedy argued that laws that are demographic in nature and do not confer concrete benefits to individuals, particular individuals, would be subjected to a rational basis review rather than a strict scrutiny review. So, you know, the concerns of not being constitutional by focusing on race, there seems to be a refutation of that from a Supreme Court justice. And I think that it's the job of the federal government. I mean, you know, in a different setting, you know, a lot of people are asking questions like, where's the Department of Justice based on the January 6th hearing? And, you know, I'm not going to get too deep into that question, but I do think that there's an overarching responsibility for the government to test how far it can go when it comes to protecting historically marginalized people, right? It is up to the government to see how far they can stretch the Constitution to result in more flexible justice, right? Stretch the Constitution, get more flexibility for justice. And so, you know, in New York State, we of course embrace that race. I believe was the brother Earl, Mr. Hatley, who, you know, referenced the 1987 report, Toxic Waste and Race. And let's be clear about one of the conclusions, right? One of the main conclusions of that report was that race, more than income, was an indicator, a greater indicator of how proximate one was to sources of pollution. So in New York, we're like, yes, we agree with that. You know, we're hoping to even join New Jersey in passing a cumulative impacts bill. Well, we passed the cumulative impacts bill. We just need the governor to sign it. Lanessa talked about that earlier. That would just prevent any proposed action that would result in exacerbating cumulative impacts or disproportionate impacts in an environmental justice or disadvantaged community from being permitted. So, Justice 40 seems to be a little bit too lenient. And, we've heard about how Executive Order 12898, it was great. Again, it does not allow for interdiction of disproportionate pollution. It says federal agencies must address. How that's addressed has never been clear. And then even when we're talking about the National Environmental Policy Act, as great as it is and necessary as it is, again, if a project is found to have an adverse impact on a given community, it can still be permitted. And I think Justice 40 is kind of like falling into that purview as well. I'm really glad that our sister Tamara shared that the information about the money that's gone out so far. I wasn't aware of that. And I'd probably have to look into that more to give like Justice 40 a full assessment. Yet, so far, I've not heard any rhapsodic grassroots organizations saying that they've been getting any money who are in DACs. So we'll have to look into that. But yeah, I mean, anything that I think is top down is suspect, right? Like we come from movements, whether it's Brother Hatley, Lanessa, who's excellent organizing, led to those victories. Those were bottom up processes. And I think that everything in this country that has been worth celebrating to some extent, the partial abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, marriage equality, now marijuana legalization, it started at the state level. It was bottom up. And I think that Justice 40 is kind of losing a bit of that spirit.
Thanks so much for that, Anthony. And I hope everybody wrote everything that he said down because it's gospel. But if you didn't, just follow us at our various organizations to see a little bit more about what we're doing. So I wanted to give you a chance to ask me a question about—
Yeah, I already have it, fam. Oh, and by the way, I'm not letting you off the hook. Tracy's birthday was just on Thursday. And we're celebrating Tracy's birthday all the way through Juneteenth. So if you should maybe put her Venmo account in there, some money, because we're going to be drinking tomorrow. Oh, anyway, that said, my question, Tracy, is that we always, when we think about like climate change in the federal government, we only think about the executive branch. More recently, the legislative branch because of the EPA case, and then of course, Congress. But what other context should we be thinking about where climate change and where environmental justice can and must be applied when we're talking about the federal government? Because it's also a whole bunch of agencies, and you do some work with agencies. And right now, just the major questions doctrine could be used against EPA to rip power away from many agencies. Where else should we be focusing and why?
Thank you so much, because I literally have dreams about this that when I wake up, I'm like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? But at the same time, I feel really energized because one, I work in a coalition. I mean, Anthony and I are part of one of those many, the constellation of progressive coalitions. But my really wonderful colleagues at Public Citizens, Americans for Financial Reform, Ocean Conservancy, Sierra Club, Acre, who does amazing work. They're small but mighty, a BIPOC-led org, which is tough to find in this environmental space. We have all been engaged for the last several months on really, like you said, kind of creating a space for larger conversations about EJ-centered work in the SEC, which seems, oh, that's odd. What does EJ have to do with the Securities and Exchange Commission? Well, actually, it has a lot to do with impacts on BIPOC communities, because what are some of the first things we know, like where do people live and what is around them? I grew up in Chicago, and I can guarantee to you there will never be an LNG facility at Oak Street Beach right off of Michigan Avenue. It'll never happen. Why is that? Now, it's on the South Side where Black people live. It's near Pilsen where Latino people live. And why is that? So the reason that we, as this large coalition, we're engaged with the SEC, largely on climate finance, but as a really fundamental aspect of that with the EJ work, is to let the Securities and Exchange Commission know that investors, and investors are really everyone, you have a 401k plan, Roth, pension, are you a casual investor just with your Charles Schwab account? These are people who actually are concerned about the impacts of their money. Are they supporting further fossil fuel extraction? And who are the people who are impacted by those extractive companies? And there are many of those people who said, no, I don't want my money to go to harming the people and the planet. So CalSTRS, the California Teachers Pension Plan, CalPERS, New York Pension Plan, we keep seeing like high levels of engagement on these matters with entities that control billions of dollars. And the way that they decide to invest their money has really huge impacts on the future or the end of fossil fuels. So let's see. But I think I just really want to, for our purposes today, I want to focus on our EJ work. And I have to, give a really huge shout out to the Ocean Conservancy and Arthi, and again, Acre, Chanel, AFR, Jessica Moon Young for their really incredible work on drafting very well-resourced, rational comment letter that lays out why there is a connection, why the SEC is right to incorporate EJ matters in. And so I kind of skipped ahead, but tying this to the Biden executive orders, his climate EO of last year was incredibly ambitious, and that really excited us in the environmental space because we're like, okay, finally, this is what he ran on, and this is what he's actually going to do. Now, granted, there's the combine of far-right forces within the Senate that have made things very difficult, but we also have to lay a huge part of the blame on Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kristen Sinema of Arizona, who have made it their purpose to thwart any efforts whatsoever to secure our planet against destruction, to secure our civil rights against obliteration. And as you see, it literally two people can upset the entire balance of our functioning government. And so even with all the work that we do, outside of our government, having two people who are deeply committed to not seeing it done, and the support that they find is very difficult to overcome. But we have not stopped. So let's not drone on. I'll just wrap it up by saying that the work that's being done to engage EJ related issues in agencies, I'm not going to say it's new, but our approach is we're taking a different tack. We also just have an abundance of thoughtful, smart, amazing people, from organizers to lawyers and everyone in between. I mean, it's so wonderful to have an elder here who was fighting for rights in the 60s to folks like us who are started here in the 21st century, and that's what's really important. This incredible line, we've inherited from all of those who've come before us, and within that inheritance, we know that we cannot relent, we cannot give up. And we will continue to find the spaces and the places to move this work really innovatively. And we're drawing from an incredible wellspring of information and knowledge. And I just have to also say that I'm really grateful that I am an alumna of Vermont Law School, because I wouldn't have had any of I wouldn't have understood this, I wouldn't have the access, I wouldn't have met the great people who helped me move to this space.
Amazing. I'm not sure how much more time we have before we go to Ms. Sherry, but and maybe we'll segue it over, because I to dig more into Justice 40. I would just say that, like, especially when we're talking about investments, bonds, and things like that, if Justice 40 is done correctly, our sister Tamara talked about, they're using the term benefits in New York. We said the investments, we made that clear. No Orwellian, shoulda versus coulda, just the money, the cash money. And I think that, as we are starting to get dollars and capital more, especially into our communities, like, it's going to be very, very important that the longevity of those funds, right? Because Congress is not going to allow for a boatload of money to be coming to Black, Brown, and Indigenous people forever, right? It's going to be a point where, like, whoa, so that it's going to be very important to make those dollars last. And I think with that, right, we'll kick it over to Ms. Sherry and learn more about about Justice 40.
Thanks, Tracy and Anthony. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see how that's going to work.
Yeah.
Okay, great. First of all, I want to say thanks to the students at Vermont Law for inviting me to be a part of this. I am totally amazed and blown away from where Vermont Law was when I started there, to the first Solutions Conference on Environmental Justice in 2017, to the founding of the Environmental Justice Law Society, to the development of the Environmental Justice Law Clinic. I am so proud of the leaps and bounds that the school has made to help students be able to walk into this space and feel comfortable doing it. It's my opportunity every time I can to talk about the experience and encourage other students to attend Vermont Law, because I think it's an awesome place to be. But I want to spend some time today talking about what I do here in North Carolina, the Justice 40 initiative, and just one particular component of the Justice 40 initiative, which is the focus on renewable energy sources, or transitioning to renewable energy sources, and how that effort impacts Black and Brown and Indigenous communities in the state of North Carolina. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the slides, but the North Carolina Conservation Network, for which I work, is a network of about 60 environmental organizations across the state that trains, coordinates, and works with diverse groups in order to bring them into the mainstream. We're working very hard to try and diversify some of the work that the organization has been doing in the past. We are working with historically impacted communities within the state. We have a group of community leaders from across the state that we meet with on a bi-weekly basis, so that we can make sure that we're on track in terms of the initiatives that we're considering, in terms of the legislation that we are considering, and talking with elected officials to try to get introduced and supported. For our work, our community leaders play a key role in everything that we're doing. In order to do that, we're not just working with those community members, we're trying to get them in front of elected officials, giving them opportunities to participate at public hearings, at legislative hearings on various issues. And we're working very hard to create sort of that next generation of environmental justice leaders here in the state, which is going to be very important for us in the future. And part of the reason that it is important to us in the future is that this is the 40th anniversary of the Warren County protests, which most of you are aware started the national environmental justice movement back in 1982. And out of that came the GAO report, and then the United Church of Christ report, Toxic Waste and Race, that was referred to earlier, that Charles Lee actually wrote, and has had a huge impact. And this year we're working very hard with the Warren County community to make sure that we elevate what has happened there, that we're passing the torch on, but at the same time, we're saying to the state, we are in much better condition 40 years later than we were 40 years ago when that PCB was dumped in that community in Warren County. As I said, we're working with state agencies to try and make sure that they're collecting, tracking, analyzing, reporting data to assure that that data is used in an appropriate way in permitting decisions. Unfortunately, right now it's not. Health data is not incorporated in the mapping tool that the State Department of Environmental Quality uses. So there are actually two systems. The Department of Health and Human Services has one, DEQ has a different one, but that one at DEQ does not have the state's health data in it. So there are still some real concerns because that is not being used in the best way possible. And finally, we're working to try and make sure that cumulative impacts is considered in permitting decisions. At this point, the state does not consider cumulative impacts, and until EPA decides to get its act together and provide some cumulative impact guidance, probably nothing will happen. Unfortunately, EPA has been sitting on proposed recommendations since 2010, and this year decided to dust those off and try to make them final. So I would encourage anyone who has the will to write EPA to tell them that they need to get that done quick, fast, and in a hurry for many communities across the country. The Justice 40 initiative, as folks have already said, was established under EO 408, and it established the Domestic Policy Office, as well as encouraging agencies to make sure that 40% of benefits go to impacted communities. I want to spend a little time on this slide, and then, as I said, I want to talk more about the renewable sources of energy, because that is near and dear to my heart, and you'll understand why by the time we finish, and why it's important to BIPOC communities. The administration encouraged, or is encouraging, movement from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, but in that discussion of renewable energy sources is a lot of greenwashing, and it hasn't been talked about enough. The feds don't understand how renewable energy production impacts local communities, and all of our efforts so far haven't gotten very many people to understand that renewable energy is indeed greenwashing when we look at what's happening here in North Carolina specifically. I graduated Vermont law, moved back home to the town that I grew up in, which is a rural part of North Carolina. We are #2 in hog production. We are #1 in turkey production. We have the largest landfill in the state. We have an in vivo wood pellet processing plant, so we have a lot of deforestation going on. And there are 2 biogas processing facilities within a mile of each other in a very rural community who are concerned because each entity is proposing creating this biogas in 2 very different ways. One proposes to pipe it from about 30 miles away. The other one proposes to take tank trucks to go to local hog farms and extract the effluent, which is the fluid from the hog waste, into trucks and truck it to a warehouse where a renewable energy process would occur. So there are a lot of concerns about what that looks like. As I mentioned earlier, we are the birthplace of the National Environmental Justice Movement, and depending on who you talk to, they will tell you that that our top money maker in the state is agriculture. There are other studies that would suggest that's not the case, that agriculture is actually #3, but the ag industry has, I would say, a hold on legislative and elected officials here in the state. And as a result of that, there are many decisions that have been made at the legislative level that impact BIPOC communities. Key agencies are not incorporating community voices in their decision-making processes, in the permitting process, in the public hearing process, as well as the legislature passing laws that prevent communities from being able to even file nuisance lawsuits. And for any of you who are aware, there were nuisance lawsuits filed against the industry a number of years ago. After those nuisance lawsuits were filed, the legislature passed a law basically that will prevent BIPOC communities in the future from filing nuisance lawsuits in the state. To give you a better perspective of what the problem is for us, is swine is over 9 million animals in the state. It is approved right now, or they are permitted under a general water permit. The agency does not see these lagoons as discharging, so they are under non-discharge permits. The state has 4 of the top 20 hog producing counties in the United States, and we're all within 50 miles of each other. As I said, my county is number 2. The county next to me is number 1. The county about 35 miles away from me is number 11. And there's one other county about 35 miles away from me in another direction that's also in the top 20. Within 35 miles of me is the largest hog manufacturing center in the world. They kill and process about 32,000 hogs a day. And the problem with the swine and lagoon system and the way it's being proposed and permitted maintains a lagoon and spray field system, which is an antiquated system that's been used in North Carolina since the 80s. This is a picture of what a lagoon and spray field or lagoon and house system looks like. Those buildings house the animals, and those areas that are kind of reddish purple are actually cesspools of hog waste. The hog waste is washed out of the houses and put in these cesspool areas where they are kept. And over time, they are sprayed on adjoining fields where farmers grow organic vegetables. So one of the problems now, or one of the things now we're trying to do, is also educate people to understand that you need to understand where your food is coming from and who's impacted by the processes under which that food is produced. This is an example of a spray field. As you see, it looks sort of like an irrigation system. But if you get close enough to it, what's coming out of that is a brown residue. And it tends to get on nearby houses. Statistics show that predominantly African-American or other minorities live within 3 miles of these operations. So they are more adversely affected than anyone else when these kinds of things are going on. And this is the ranking that I mentioned earlier. Duplin County, Sampson County, Bladen, and Wayne County is number 17. As you can see in the last column, the minority population, each one of those is relatively high in comparison to other populations in those counties. The second industry that's a problem, and CAFOs as well, because concentrated animal feeding operations, is poultry. According to the North Carolina Poultry Federation, the economic impact to the state is $39.76 billion. It's the #1 agricultural industry in the state. The top 3 producers of poultry in the state and growing are 2 of the counties on that list for swine, and Robeson County, which is a county that's about equally divided among Native American, African American, and whites. There are about 5.3 million turkeys and chickens that are produced in the state, and it's ranked #2 nationally in total turkey production. And the county that I live in is ranked #1 in total turkey production in the country. In many cases, the problem here again is that hog farms and poultry farms are often juxtaposed next to each other. So the longer barns are the hog operations, the shorter barns are the poultry operations, and those areas that are either sort of pink or brown are the lagoons. So we have problems with, and many of those are located near streams, and there's a lot of runoff. So we have problems with contamination, with water contamination. We have problems with air pollution because methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide are several of the components that happen during the decomposition process while these open pits are decomposing. The health impacts are another issue in these communities. As I said, these operations are contaminating groundwater. I co-founded with some of my BLS friends a nonprofit here in Sampson County called the Environmental Justice Community Action Network. And we are now providing free water testing to many of these communities in conjunction with two of our academic partners, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Appalachian State University. And we hope to be able to expand that work so that more folks will know what they are drinking. Most of folks in the area on well water, as I said, and so we found components that would be associated with living near these operations. High levels of arsenic in water, high levels of nitrates, high levels of total coliform, and lead in some cases. And we're still trying to figure out in some of those homes where the lead is coming from, if it is from lead that's underground or if it's from aging lead pipes within those homes. We also have high rates of disease. I got a call just a few days ago about a particular community near the landfill who's also surrounded by hog and poultry farms that they're seeing over the last 2 or 3 months, a really high level of death. And they're concerned that some of these deaths are closely associated with where they live and what they're having to smell and deal with on a daily basis in that area. Safe water is a consideration. And as I said, cumulative impacts are not being considered. Community members can't enjoy their property because they can't even go outside because of the awful smell, because of the flies, because of if the spray field or if the field near their home is being sprayed, they may be being exposed to the feces that is coming out of those systems. And so there are a lot of issues, and again, why we are trying to educate communities and trying to educate folks outside of our community about why the whole idea of renewable energy is a problem for us, because where it gets produced creates an additional burden on the community when we look at what's going on with that. There was a farm bill in 2021 that will allow additional lagoons to be built on these existing farms to allow for anaerobic digesters to be installed. Those anaerobic digesters, at least in one situation here, is what will be used to capture the methane under unnatural conditions and transport it by pipeline to a facility that will convert it into natural gas and will then be injected into gas systems of Dominion Energy out of Virginia. Duke Power is looking at the same possibility. There is a liquid nitrogen gas facility in Robeson County, which is predominantly Lumbee Indian in the middle, basically, of tribal lands. So there are issues that, again, need to be considered when we look at BIPOC communities and what Justice 40 is claiming that they're doing when they're converting from fossil fuels to renewable natural gas. In North Carolina and a number of other states, reps also include this renewable gas or biogas. And so that is a huge concern as we're talking about what our future looks for these communities. Cumulative impacts is a huge issue here for a lot of reasons, and cumulative impacts does not get considered. And I'll just give you one example of why it's important here. With one of the facilities that are a mile apart, within about a quarter mile of that proposed facility is a feed silo for hogs, a community trash dump, About a mile away is a feed facility for poultry. So there are 18-wheelers going and coming constantly. So diesel fuel emissions, they are right off the exit ramp of Interstate 40, which is a highway that runs from North Carolina to California. As a result of that highway, a lot of smaller businesses have built up. So people on the way to the beach or away from the beach are stopping to eat. There is a spray field. There is a huge hog farm. And so right across from this African-American community is a huge cornfield where they're spraying the waste on the field. I've had the opportunity to talk to many of the community members there. The growers have gotten smart enough now not to do it most of the time during the day. They'll do it after dark. And they've told me that sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'll wake up and the smell is so bad that they're even having trouble breathing in their own home. So until EPA creates guidelines and directs state agencies to do something about cumulative impacts, BIPOC communities on the ground will continue to suffer, even with Justice 40 in place. The state, as it stands now, requires very little monitoring, does not require any analysis of the air, soil, or groundwater. Efforts to try and get that done have been squashed. The agency did a number of years ago put out air monitors, but put them so far away that they would not accurately assess the condition of the air, and then wrote a report saying that there wasn't a problem. So that creates another problem for folks within the community. As I said earlier, these permits are non-discharge permits as far as the agency is concerned. They totally ignore the fact that there are often breaches of these lagoons, and there is seepage because many of the older lagoons are clay lined and not lined with a suitable type of underlining. And so therefore there are always problems with leakage. There are problems with algal blooms in times of the year when you wouldn't expect them. There are fish kills. There are all kinds of problems, again, associated with this whole process of CAFOs and operations of those CAFOs, and trying to justify and greenwash what they're doing to try and convert some of that waste into renewable natural gas. The legislature in our community, in our state, has limited new operations, but that really hasn't created a good environment either, because the industry still finds another way to make money and justify what they're doing. The State Department of Environmental Quality has constantly seen its budget reduced when they try to do something good for the community. And right now we're going through a process of approval of a general permit for digester systems that will be similar to the one that already exists for water. So there will be very few requirements for monitoring. And it has been pretty much decided by the agency that there will be very little opportunity to put in specific requirements for some of the operations that have a history of violations. So we are even more concerned now that we will see heavier groundwater pollution, heavier air pollution, and just a real concern about what it's going to mean to be producing biogas in two different ways in communities that are low income, minority, and without a lot of resources to combat what is going on. And I just put this slide up. Again, it's part of our renewable energy portfolio. Methane, while it is a very hazardous gas, to use a digester to create methane is creating an unnatural situation so that they have enough methane to capture to justify creating it into this renewable natural gas that they are touting as a solution and another way for farmers to make money off of growing these pigs. So we still are trying to educate, and here is an example of what it looks like when one of those lagoons overflows. And You see the line of trees here to the right, and sort of back behind the trees is a stream. So when one of these operations overflows, it creates major problems for all of the adjoining area and for folks who live around those areas. And most of these operations are maintained by migrant workers. And we see them, or at least we say the growers see them as their emergency operations folks. When we had flooding during Hurricane Matthew, one grower in one local county got a call from emergency services because farm workers were in housing that was provided by him, and the water was rising, and they were calling to get assistance. The local EMS services office called the farmer and said, "Is there a problem?" And he said, "No, there's not." The migrants continued to call to get assistance, and one of the local migrant organizations were able to get them on airlifted out of where they were. Otherwise, they probably would have all died. So from the perspective of many of the growers, these workers are disposable. And so that's another issue that we're trying to work with, to engage more migrant workers so that we can start working together. The growers have in the past tried to convince them that the environmentalists were their enemies and they should only listen to them. And when the pandemic hit, I believe they started seeing the difference. They weren't getting PPE and some of the other things that they needed to be safe and to keep their families safe. And finally, these are some of the things that are happening in North Carolina now to challenge what's going on. There is a state administrative hearing challenge to the individual permits that have been issued. And there is a Title VI challenge right now at EPA that EPA has indicated that it has accepted for consideration of investigation. There is a challenge to the legislation that will not allow local community members to file nuisance lawsuits. That's going through the legal system. And we're still trying to build education among local communities and create champions, because a lot of the areas in these, a lot of the places in these areas are more like company towns. And so employment revolves around Smithfield, revolves around Prestige, revolves around the agricultural industry, and it's a right to work state. And so it makes people very reluctant to stand up and do anything differently. And finally, these are just some of the headlines from some of the recent actions that have been taken against the various polluting facilities that would also become part of that renewable energy transition from fossil fuel to renewable fuels. And with that, I'm sure I've run over my time, but I wanted to give everyone a sense of what it's like to live in rural America. And the message is, understand where your products, where these proposals are going, and who's impacted by the proposals at the front end of what comes out of what's supposed to be good and green at the end.
Thank you, Sherry. As Tracy mentioned, this is sobering information, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today. I want to invite Tracy and Anthony back for our Q&A section. And I just want to start by asking all of you, I think a common theme that we've heard throughout the day is that we have to hold or demand accountability from the government, from others, from other grassroots organizations, from ourselves. How do you suggest that we continue with that process while we're working together?
There's 6 principles, and Mr. Hatley kind of spoke about them inadvertently when referencing the first People of Color Conference, which of course gave us the 17 principles of environmental justice. Then in 1996, they got together again in a magical place in Jemez, New Mexico. And if you've never been there, you should all go there. It's just magic. And the 6 Jemez principles for democratic organizing were drafted and agreed to. Since then, we've seen the Jemez principles hung up on walls, at various progressive conferences, put on websites of historically white-led environmental organizations, and referenced by literally everybody. My 6-year-old knows the Hermes principles. Then it's sort of just like policy though, right? Like I think with Sherry's amazing presentation, what was demonstrated is that passing the policies, like, it's just like the beginning. It's not even when the work starts. It's the implementation phase that determines who's going to benefit and who is not. And it's the same thing with indigenous wisdom as well as environmental justice, was like the Hermes principles. We have the tools. We've had the tools. Indigenous folk have had the tools. Indigenous folk to Africa who brought those tools or those tools were brought to this country by force. We have them. It's just about the will to implement them, so that we're not having the same conversations as, and I'm not trying to make our brother Earl like the elder and call him out, but Brother Earl is probably seeing some of the same things that he dealt with when he created the foundation that me, Tracy, Sherry, and Tamara stand on right now.
Echoing all of that, thank you, Anthony. As someone who comes out of a political and union organizing background, I know that will that is contained with us, that is contained within us to move things forward. As Anthony said, it is not, the policy is the floor from which everything else must grow, right? Because we have to have some organizing principles to come around, like we agree upon X, Y, Z. Now, how do we put it into force? And I know that's something that that Anthony and, well, I'm sure all of us grapple with on a daily basis. How do we move people to action? And that action within the American political system, American policy system, is money and elections, like just pretty much.
It's 1 o'clock.
Sorry, that's the voice of Steve Jobs telling me what time it is. So in that, and of course, for us organizing within BIPOC communities, that we are asking people who are marginalized, who do not have that same access to capital, to move mountains that are built by capitalism, is very difficult, but it has been done. What did Nelson Mandela say? Is like, everything seems impossible until it is possible. So it's unfortunate that our communities have to consistently leap over ever rising barriers to achieve a thimbleful, a sip of equality that others feel. But although that has been our history, let us hope that that is not going to remain our future.
I think, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Earl.
Well, I just wanted to say that I appreciated what Anthony said, and I feel like my purpose now is to be a voice for where we've been and where we are, and what I'm trying to do is hold the line, that we don't slip backwards. And I hear from a lot of younger organizers a lack of understanding of where we've been and how we got to where we are, and don't understand how we're sliding backwards. And so I feel like that's my purpose, is to help us hold the line so that we don't slide back. And I look to the younger folks to help us move forward from here. And so I want to help with us moving forward. But it's up to the younger folks to move us forward. And all I can do is help with that. As elder, if that's what I am, I still feel like a warrior. I don't know what elder means, because as long as I can breathe, I'm going to be a warrior for Mother Earth. So that's all I know. And I want to stand with the younger folks coming up to move us forward and not allow us to take one step back, but to keep walking forward from here. But I do see us sliding back as we get the pushback from industry, and they're finding clever ways to push us back. And I'm seeing it because I write permit comments all the time. And in the other groups that I work with, I'm seeing the pressures and I'm seeing how they're pushing us back. And so that's what I'm looking at, and I'm wanting to impress upon all the young organizers coming up. This is where we are. This is how they're pushing us back. We need to organize, because I'm an organizer. I believe in organizing. I've seen organizing win over and over and over. And also see how organizing changes policy. And so, you know, the lawyers are out working to make policy, but they need the organizers pushing in order to have their backs so that we can together write these policies and make them happen. And so together with the legal and the organizers and the groundswell, we can make this happen, just like we did in creating environmental justice movement in the first place and getting all the way up to the executive order. I want us to get all the way up to codifying environmental justice, giving it teeth so we can sue for environmental justice violations, but even more than that, you know, so we really bring justice to our communities, and we bring justice to Mother Earth, you know, to how we live, and so I'm looking to the young folks, you know, to help us do that now, because this is where we are, and yeah.
The key to all of this is absolutely organizing, but in working on the local level, I'm discovering how many of our local community members in the past have the joke here, and there's actually a documentary out now called The Smell of Money. And for many years here, when these god-awful smells would come out of these hog farms or out of the Lundy's packing company here in town, the communities around it who were mostly employed there would say, oh, well, that's just the smell of money. And it's been tolerated for a long time, but once we started working with them to educate, the second piece of that is that there has to be more political activism than there has been on the local level. I think that C3s need to at least look at the possibility of forming C4s when they can, so that you stay out of trouble as a C3 and you have that separate entity, because we've seen here in the state, once the nuisance lawsuits were filed, there was litigation from the Port Council, and it appeared to be an effort to find out more about where C3 money was coming from. I'm sure to try and influence stopping some of that C3 funding coming from the various entities. So I think there are a lot of tactics that are going to have to be considered. And I think that we're going to have to call on party officials to stop. And again, I'm vested in rural communities. I'm sick and tired of national parties thinking that they should concentrate on urban and suburban areas and forget that rural areas are out here and need to be dealt with and supported. And until they do that, I personally have made the decision not to make another contribution of another dime to any of them. And anytime I get a solicitation, I send a note back and say, until you decide to invest some of your energy and money into places like where I live, you won't get my money. And I think we've got to start taking some steps and pushing back so that we build the power that we need, because everybody listens to money. That's the only thing they listen to. And until we start making them aware that we have money in our communities that can make a difference, and organizing in our community that can make a difference, and stop selling ourselves short, we aren't going to see any movement forward on anything from local level, from national level, or any place else.
Thank you, Sherry. There was a question in the chat and I just want to read it out loud. So those who haven't seen it, from Professor Pamela Vesseland. She said, hi, Sherry, we met your 1L year at EJLS and discovered that we both were motivated by the North Carolina CAFR industries to study law. Thank you for taking your skills back to our home state. You've mentioned working with UNC. I'm wondering whether you've seen legislative pressure on state university programs at UNC, NC State, NC A&T, et cetera, to prevent their work on research advocacy or litigation that would be considered anti-ag.
I responded to that just briefly, but I'll expand on that response. There was one blatant example. There was a center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill named after Julius Chambers that took on the cases to support local efforts and community. And once our legislature switched and the Board of Trustees in the state changed, they made a decision that students shouldn't be working in clinics providing services to communities and clinics. So they defunded that center and it no longer exists. In other situations, even HBCUs are so happy to get industry money. I was talking to a student from one of the HBCUs who's in one of the ag-related programs, and not until she sat in a meeting with some of us talking about some of the issues, she said, oh my God, I'm in ag, I'm in the agriculture program at this school. And they mention CAFOs, but they never talk about the impact on Black and brown communities. And so we still have situations where our universities are willing to take the money and to some extent sell out and not tell these students the real truth about what's happening on the ground. And so those kinds of things need to be addressed as well.
Along those same lines, I think some schools are criticized for their environmental programs because they don't include environmental justice discussions. Would you agree that's the same policy as far as really understanding the nuances of the issues that are on the ground?
I would say that's true as well. I teach an environmental justice course in the spring at Duke University in their graduate program. And the students want the information. The students want to be able to learn. And the reason that course exists now is because students pushed the university to create a course that they could take. This fall, there will be two. There will be one in the fall and one in the spring. And I am coordinating with the other professors so that, you know, our courses kind of overlap, but they don't, so that students don't have to take one as a prerequisite to the other one. But until universities are intentional in their curriculum, we're still missing a huge opportunity to educate them. We're in North Carolina. There's still students, Black and brown and indigenous, who don't realize that North Carolina is really ground zero for the national environmental justice movement. And so one of the things that I do, except for when COVID happened, was to take students out to a community so they can see. And for most of them, it's a life-changing experience, you know, for them to see how folks actually live on the ground. And I've had students say to me, reading it in a book is one thing, but actually being able to go out and talk to the folks who live it on a daily basis makes a lot of difference. So I think that all of us need to be more intentional about making sure that these folks go out and hear the stories of folks who live in these communities, because it is life-changing. We do tours periodically. We'll get a call here and say, can I come down and see all that stuff that's going on in your county? And by the time they leave, they're trying to figure out how they can help, or who they know that, you know, can help do some work in the area, because there's just so much stuff here that the communities need to deal with. And another thing I didn't say about the infrastructure money, all of that money that's coming down for infrastructure to the various counties, the problem with that is that the elected officials are the one who's making the decisions about where that money is going to be used. Nonprofits or non-elected officials cannot apply for that money. And we have communities here who've been trying to get water infrastructure outside of, you know, well water for 30 years and haven't been able to do it, because whenever federal dollars come in, they go to the more affluent areas of the county with the justification that that's where they need to put the money. And so as a result, you have the economic impact, because nobody wants to build a factory or bring a new industry into an area where they've got to depend on well water versus, you know, having a system that is dependable across the county. So there are a lot of issues. And the urban rural divide is getting wider and wider here in this state. I don't know what's happening in other states, but it's just something that we've got to deal with that has sort of been one of those conversations we don't have that much. So every space that I'm in, I want to talk about that divide and educate people on what's happening in these communities so that maybe, you know, folks will start trying to understand what is impacting various communities across the country.
Yeah, if I may, I would also like to add that in Oklahoma, where we're also heavily impacted by hog and poultry operations, we have 39 federally recognized tribes, as well as 7 historic African-American communities and historic African-American college. Our land grant university actually develops the regulations for confined animal feeding operations for the Oklahoma DEQ. And that college houses the environmental science department, of which I'm an alum, at the agricultural school there on the campus. So environmental science is housed in agriculture. Agriculture develops the regs for confined animal feeding operations, and the Department of Agriculture in the state of Oklahoma. So, and the Department of Agriculture is funded by Cargill and some of the leading poultry and hog operations in the world. So they're funding that school. They have their names on all the buildings of that school, and they endow the professors. And the students are getting endowments as well, the graduate students. In my PhD program there, I was turning those down and got the heck out of there as fast as I could and didn't go back, and then fought against them. But nevertheless, that's what's going on there. So that tells you just how ingrained all of that is in the students coming out. Where are they going to go to work, you know, after that experience?
It's almost like needing to deprogram.
Well, yeah, big time. Yeah. I mean, they're I don't know what happened to me, because I came out running to John Cronin and wanted to become a river keeper. I was an organizer while I was going through that school, and I was giving counter lectures to the professors the entire time. I don't even know how I got out of there and made it through, but I was the antagonist through the whole thing. I just could not drink their Kool-Aid, but nevertheless, everybody else was.
Thank you, Earl, and our panelists from panel 2. We most likely will have extra time near the end for extra questions if you're open to this discussion, but I'd like to continue our program and introduce the second organization that we'll be featuring today. Next is Carolyn Farrell, who is Executive Director for Center of Race, Poverty, and the Environment based out of California. CRPE is a national environmental justice organization providing legal and technical assistance to grassroots groups in low-income communities and communities of color. They combine community organizing, legal representation, policy advocacy, and coalition building to create power and systemic change at the local level. CRPE represents the needs of local communities and works directly with them to achieve their goals. Furthering their mission is to help establish community groups that can advocate for their needs and work together. Please allow me to introduce Carolyn Farrell, who will tell you more about CRPE's work and their active initiatives.
Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate being asked to participate and to be featured as an organization. CRPE has benefited a lot from a Vermont Law School, particularly with law clerks. Both Sherry and Tamara have both been law clerks for CRPE early on in their careers, and so really excited about that. And to be on panel, be on a program with them is a real honor. The Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment was actually founded by two people that Tamara talked about, Luke Cole and Ralph Abascal. So CRPE comes out of like the public interest, public lawyering field. We were founded in San Francisco in California, but much of our work happened in the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is in the rural middle part of the state. And I'm actually based in our Delano office, which is in Kern County. And Kern's sort of the ag and oil area of the state. And so we have a lot of the same sort of issues that Sherry mentioned around CAFOs and dairies, as well as a lot of the issues related to fossil fuel extraction and the oil and gas industry. So issues of industry capture of local institutions and power at the expense of community is really very much present in the Valley. And oftentimes, California is seen as being green and progressive, but there are parts of it, it's debatable just generally as a statement, but certainly in the rural parts of California, it's very conservative, very sort of traditional Republican values being expressed in power. So we're working often with BIPOC communities in rural California, predominantly Latinx communities who are predominantly farm workers, communities living sort of paycheck to paycheck, and if that, and really trying to build community power to push back against the predominantly white, conservative, sort of capitalists in the area. But to tell you a little bit about CRPE in our history, we were founded in 1989, and throughout our trajectory of work, we've focused on combining legal and organizing. So really focusing on community lawyering as a strategy of working hand in hand with organizers to build community power. And by that, we mean working with communities to identify the problems that they're facing, and then to work to build power to build solutions for those problems that are community identified and community led. And then the third phase of building power is actually to ensure that those solutions are actually adopted and implemented. As Anthony and Tracy mentioned, implementation is a huge part, in the most important part of policy development. If it's not implemented, then it doesn't really exist and it doesn't really benefit anybody. And so we're building power to ensure that communities see the results that they've been advocating for. And then we combine legal and organizing with policy advocacy. So we recognize that the rules as they're written now were not necessarily written to protect the communities that we're working for. And the institutions like the courts and the elected officials are not necessarily implementing the laws as written in ways that benefit the communities we're working with. And so we try and change the laws. We try and write new laws, get new standards set, and work with communities to identify what those laws should be. And sometimes those are structural reforms. Over the last 8 years, we worked with communities in the San Joaquin Valley and in Southern California dealing with hazardous waste cleanup and disposal sites to identify solutions, because California was failing. The agency charged with protecting communities and cleaning up sites was just absolutely failing the communities living near and on top of those sites. And we actually advocated and identified for structural reforms to create an actual board that would create transparency and accountability rather than allowing a single director to make backroom deals, and also that would change the fee structures that polluters had to pay to the agency. And it took 8 years, 2 gubernatorial administrations, a lot of advocacy at the legislature just to identify that there was a problem. But finally, this past year, the governor adopted, or the legislature passed and the governor signed the bill that would create this entity, this board. And now the fight is about making sure the board actually works, making sure that the people who are appointed are actually in line with the mission and the vision that the community had for the board, as well as to make sure the board, in conducting its business, does so in a transparent and accountable way, and that the decisions that the agency makes are much more community protective than they have ever been in the past. So it's these kinds of like community-led structural reforms that are possible with community organizing, base building, and really making sure that you're listening to the communities that are most impacted by an issue. But over the course of our history, we started working, when we first started in 1989, on working on hazardous waste disposal sites. So the three toxic dumps in California are all located in predominantly farm worker communities. And the reason for that was codified in a report that was done by the state agency, or commissioned by the state agency, charged with regulating these entities. And the report basically said, they didn't cite geological factors, they didn't cite construction standards. They said these facilities are best cited in communities that have low English literacy, are workers in the extraction economy like agriculture and oil, predominantly Catholic communities, low English speaking communities. Basically, without saying it, Latino communities in California are the places where these should be cited, because you're not going to get much opposition to their citing. And therefore, those are the places that are most attractive to cite them. So the history of toxic waste in California, as in the rest of the country, is very much based on race, very much based on exploitation of people. And so we started out with hazardous waste, progressed to toxics more generally, like with pesticides in agriculture, and that progressed to air quality, which also dealt with water quality, which also dealt with dairies and CAFOs, as Sherry was talking about, which has led to working on climate change and fighting false solutions to climate change, like the dairy digesters and biofuels that Sherry mentioned, as well as other false solutions like carbon capture and underground storage, which are now currently big proposals that are often cited for BIPOC communities in rural areas, are often seen as the most attractive sites for those types of facilities. And it's all experimental. It's all put it in the ground, like burying it has ever been a solution, and we'll figure it out later. And so our advocacy has always been about informing communities about these issues, talking with them about what their concerns are, what their needs are, and trying to access more information, and then lifting up their rights in the existing system, as well as advocating for new rights, new protections through public policy. And often this is an important part of like coalition building to build collective power, both regionally as well as within the state. And one of the things we're working on now is how do we create community identified projects that can attract some of this Justice 40 money. We've been getting more involved in economic development, and economic justice is a key part of environmental justice, and making sure that the communities are leading not only in designing like what the policies should be, but actually designing what the project should be. And to one of Sherry's points earlier about the disconnect between rural and life and policy, we're seeing in California a lot of proposals around building decarbonization as part of a climate strategy. And we have a project where we're actually working on building, we didn't think that's what we were working on. We didn't know it was building decarb. What we were trying to do was get communities to transition from propane to natural gas because they were disconnected from the natural gas grid, predominantly rural farm worker communities, Latinx communities in very small clusters, in sort of isolated pockets in rural counties, just not connected to the grid at all by design, and having to rely on propane. And so we were able to get a proceeding going where we would examine going from propane to natural gas. But we decided, why don't we just leapfrog over natural gas and try for renewable energy through solar or some other community energy system? And that's where we are now. We're sort of working with communities to get connected to electric, solar power and change out appliances and do all of that with funding through the Public Utilities Commission. But the struggle we're having is that, the current policies around weatherization, around decarbonization, are really not suited to rural housing that have seen disinvestment for decades. And so how do you create programs that actually support communities where they are now and help them get to a true renewable energy future? And right now, California is not really thinking about that. They're just thinking about the standard. Let's set the standard, and it's like, we'll build it and they will come. And it's like, that doesn't happen. It has to be intentional. There has to be a lot of investment. And so we're kind of learning as we're going and trying to use the lessons that we're learning in rural communities like Alpaw, Allensworth, and Ducor to inform the state on what it should be doing in order to build equity into its building decarbonization policies. So we're kind of doing a little bit of everything. So we're now doing environmental justice and economic justice and trying to make it all work. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for bringing us really to a close. Unfortunately, our last organization couldn't make it. We do have some time left. I don't know if the speakers who are still here would be open to more questions, but please let us know. If not, we can wrap up. I know it's been a long day, and of course, we're appreciative of all your time, but please let me know if anyone's open to more questions. We certainly have some that we can ask. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Anthony. Anthony's down to answer some more questions. I don't know if Tracy, Sherry, Earl, Vanessa, I see you're still here. Perfect, great. We'll spend another 10 minutes or so, and then we can wrap up for the day. I did want to ask, what are some of your expectations about being in right relationship and sharing power, especially as you're involved in community lawyering or through the community lawyering perspective? How does that help you accomplish the goals that you have in the work that you do?
Just really quick. I mean, I'm sorry I have my camera up. I'm eating because it's 1:30 and I got hungry. And I would say that in terms of our goals from a community lawyering lens, which New York lawyers the public interest were pioneers in, I don't want to use that word, I'm sorry, innovators in community lawyering. And it just forms the foundation of everything that we do. We don't parachute in, right? We listen and, we, to Tracy's point earlier, like help communities realize what is possible beyond even what is possible. But they're the leaders. That's it. I mean, that when Tamara was talking about investments versus benefits, I always said, who's going to tell any community what's a benefit for them except for that community? Give them the money and they'll determine what the benefit is, and then they will go and make it so. So from that sense, like, you know, honestly, the goal is what we've been taught by Indigenous people, especially here in Turtle Island, of self-determination. And self-determination starts with those Semez principles, letting people speak for themselves, letting people organize for themselves, and knowing Sherry knows what's appropriate in her community. I'm not going to go in there and say this is what you should do. I'm going to go in there and say, how can I help since your liberation is tied up in mine? And the same with Mr. Hatley, and of course that's what Tracy and I do every day in DC, is just trying to increase self-determination. You go there, and then everything else can grow from that.
Thanks for that, Anthony. And I was away from my community for a long time, so I go to many of people in the community who've been here for many years during the time I was out and say, okay, what do we need to do? The community lawyering piece is interesting because communities like this have to depend on nonprofit organizations to provide services to them. So two of the more prominent ones, the Julius Chambers Center became the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And so there's been assistance from them challenging the nuisance lawsuits. The Southern Environmental Law Center has been on the front lines for a lot of different fights in local communities, and they are partners, and they all understand that they don't come in with the lawyer hats on. They come in as partners to listen to the community because they are the true experts in understanding and knowing what the need is, and then, you know, moving forward from there. So it's really more of a partnership, and I think we all have to leave the labels at the door in order to be successful in trying to make sure that the least of us are being taken care of in an appropriate way.
I wanted to add in, first of all, I love both of those responses from you, Sherry and Anthony. They're so rich, and they make me feel good for being in solidarity with you in this work. At Public Citizen, which is turning 50 years old this year, we're not a huge org, but we do a lot of different work, democracy, health-related matters. We even have our own in-house litigation team that does appellate and Supreme Court work. And on my team, the climate and energy team, our focus is actually a little more hidden. Working on regulatory matters is probably like the least exciting work that folks might want to engage in, but it turns out to be an incredibly rich area in which to work. And but one really important thing that we're doing now is, of course, re-envisioning that work from being less visible to being more visible. And part of that really is the community engagement and really following what you, Sherry, and Anthony just laid out, and what Tamara laid out as well in her remarks of how do we bring in folks to these conversations without dictating what you do in your communities. And of course, on climate finance, again, these are things that people may not have the expertise at this moment, but everyone understands what it means to not have LNG facilities and other emitting polluters in their backyards, right? You don't need to have a JD to understand how that impacts you. But I mean, what do you know about writing comment letters on these things? Well, you don't. So that's part of our challenge at Public Citizen and our fellow orgs as we try to re-envision the work that we're doing in this area and engaging EJ communities.
Thank you, Tracy. Along those same lines, and bringing in something that Earl had mentioned earlier, what collaborations are available between generations, especially as we see a larger population of youth getting involved in social justice activism? And do you think there's a way to overcome some of those generational differences when you're approaching climate justice work?
If I may answer that, and it also goes to your other question, except that I'm not a lawyer. I'm a trained organizer through Industrial Areas Foundation. I've had several trainings through my close to 40-year career as an organizer. And I went back to graduate school in order to be able to help the leaders that I lift up in organizing to be able to learn to write public comments and also to interpret EPA and government documents for them as we're building their organizations. So that I could provide that expertise as we're growing their organizations, and with lack of funding, they wouldn't have to hire an expert for that until they got solid, and that's worked out really well. And the reason I say that is because I don't consider myself a leader, although I'm one of the leaders of my local organization. I look for leaders to lift up in organizing a group or in building coalitions, and look for that leadership, and then build on that leadership to work with them. And likewise, as someone who's been at it for forever, new leaders coming up, young leaders coming up, I look to them and want to lift them up in the same way as any citizens group that I'm organizing and trying to develop, and looking for leadership and mentoring them to the best of my ability, so that they become the leaders of that group and that organization, and become empowered to be leaders and to move their communities to the table and win on their issues. It's the same way with the young folks. That's my attitude with them, is that they're the leaders, they're the next generations, they're the ones that are going to move us forward. And like I said earlier, my role is to help ensure that they understand where that line is, where we may be slipping backward, and understand the history of how we got to where we are. And I think that's what elders do, is they tell the stories. And through the stories, the younger folks understand how we got to where we are and where we are, understand where we are, and understand what forward means. You don't know what forward means, otherwise. And I've watched this time and time again, moving into situations where young organizers were going the wrong direction because they didn't know where forward was. And once they heard the stories, then they went, aha, yes, we need to do this. And now this will move us forward, because there's young people in the agencies that also don't understand the story. New people coming into the agencies that don't know how these laws got the way they were, and they interpret them the wrong way. So the laws are only as good as those enforcing them, right? So it cuts both ways. And we have to educate them too, to make sure that we don't slip backwards. So that's the whole thing. And so for me, the young organizers coming up, the young lawyers coming up, the young leaders coming up, mentoring them, because they're the future, and that's how that works.
Yeah, the only thing I could add to that is I'm Jewish. We have a saying in Judaism, the old shall become new and the new shall become holy. And I think that pays homage to the cyclical and intergenerational aspects of this work. Everything that has just been said, we can't find our way. I'm West African, Sierra Leonean. without our elders acting as the guide. You know, they're kind of like our bifocals, because when we're young, our minds can sometimes wander when we're not as disciplined yet. And it's our elders that, you know, help us to see the focus of as Mr. Hatley just put it, like which way to go, like, you know, where forward is. And then, of course, there's the understanding that we are tenants of this planet right now, renting it from future generations. I have a very vivacious 6-year-old who I look at, and in addition to the responsibility of raising him to be a good non-patriarchal Black man, you know, that's going to be impossible if there's not water to drink and air to breathe, right? And then I also look at models that have been prepared by people like my mentor, the great Elizabeth Yampierre, who's the executive director of the United Puerto Rican Organization in Sunset Park, commonly known as UPROSE. And Elizabeth's, I'm on her advisory board. She's got like 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds on her advisory board who she is accountable to. And to me, that's exactly right. You know, that's another example of moving from theory to praxis, right? Because there's that old saying. I have lots of old sayings, as you can tell by now. But you know, theory without practice is blind, right? And practice without theory is just ineffective. And I think that like we have to put into practice what intergenerational and intergenerational organizing looks like. And young people, you know, I'll end with this. I did have a great honor of meeting the late John Lewis at the opening of the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery. And this is a few years after, you know, Standing Rock. And something that the congressman said was that in so many ways, Standing Rock reminded him of his days in SNCC, because Standing Rock was very youth-led, very, very youth-led. Of course, homage was and respect was paid to the elders. However, it was like youth who were putting that on the map when the news wasn't covering, youth running from Standing Rock all the way to DC, running. You know, so they were very much in leadership. And we also know that SNCC was a very young person's movement as well, with the freedom rides and all of that. So, you know, it can't be done without everybody in it. It's not like we have the luxury on our side to pick and choose, you know, who we get to struggle with, because you know, we do have numbers, but like their power is very strong. And so we're going to need everyone, you know, of all ages. And of course, young people have just as much of a leg in this fight as anybody else.
In addition, to talk about a little bit, the Conservation Network is doing to try and do to engage more young people. As I said, we have a group of community leaders that we meet with on a bi-weekly basis, but the average age for those folks are probably 60. And so what we're actively trying to do is create a youth roundtable, or whatever we end up calling it, and reaching out to some of the young leaders that we're aware of and some that we may not be, to start a dialogue so that over time we can have an intergenerational group within Conservation Network, so that that torch is passed and the knowledge is passed on, so that those younger folk can keep the fight going when many of us have stepped away from the stage. I suspect that as far as Earl and I go, we'll be around until whatever day the good Lord decides to call us home. But you know, that's just one of the things that we have to start thinking about. And there will be, as I mentioned, the 40th anniversary of the Warren County protest is September the 17th in Warren County this year. It's going to be a huge event. And there will be an effort to pass the torch figuratively at that event to the younger folks who have been engaged, but also younger folks who haven't been engaged, too, looking for an opportunity to learn and to become engaged.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I think with that, we have reached the end of our program for today. I want to thank all of you again for participating as our speakers, our panelists, and organizations, and joining us, offering your expertise while discussing racial injustice and, of course, the climate movement. Thank you to our audience. I know some people are gone already, but I appreciate all of you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and were able, or you are able, to implement some of the takeaways that we discussed today. I want to extend a very special thank you to the Vermont Law School support staff in events, communications, and production support. Thank you to Nina Russo for putting us on the calendar, for Parker Thurston, who facilitated our streaming capabilities today, and for Karen Henderson, who and her team for creating the amazing graphics that we were able to share with everyone. It was an absolute pleasure working with all of you. And thank you for your patience with us throughout this process. I want to thank Amy Laura Khan, the director of Vermont Law School's Environmental Justice Clinic, and our faculty advisor, Ariel King, co-founder and former co-chair of EJLS, for working with us as we strategize for today's discussion. Thank you for your guidance and your willingness to bounce ideas with us. We are, of course, appreciative of all your work and the time that you dedicated to perfecting today's schedule. And even with that, I know we had some bumps in the road. Thank you to our e-board and our general body members, and especially, again, thank you to all our attendees and the EJ convening. We appreciate your time, and we hope everyone enjoys the rest of your weekend, especially in commemoration and celebration of Juneteenth tomorrow. We hope you all take a moment to celebrate and, of course, ponder the significance of the holiday. It has been a pleasure guiding you all through today's discussion. I thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Of course.